I don't typically share things here, but given the gravity of this story, it's certainly something that I want to get off my chest, as I've been holding on to this for well over a year now. I currently work as a 911 dispatcher, which, as I'm sure you can guess, is far from the most chill occupation that one can have. Not only are we dealing with people in crisis, some of whom are truly facing life and death situations, but we also bear the brunt of a system that doesn't exactly endear one to join this semi-thankless profession. You didn't ask, but I'm going to tell you. According to the powers that be, we as dispatchers are looked at as clerical staff. Basically, people that sit at front desks and simply take calls. Not as people that direct calls to the proper authorities and make sure that needy citizens get the help that they need in a proper amount of time. We're saddled with long hours due to staff shortages, mandatory overtime, a workload that makes it hard to have anything left once you get off the clock, and none of the medical or mental wellness safety nets provided to first responders, which, as I just highlighted, the government does not count us as. It is also a sensationalized profession that, in movies and on TV, looks as if we are in high-tech war rooms with monitors everywhere and every tool in the book at our fingertips. I cannot stress enough that this is far from the case. It's me, a single computer, my headset, and an emergency phone line that never seems to stop ringing. I say that to highlight the fact that there are no shortage of people in need out there on a daily and nightly regimen. While we are connected with fire, police, and emergency services, we are not the ones personally driving the ambulance or police cars. We're the ones on the phone with someone who is perhaps fighting for their lives or watching some helpless person get hurt. I can't get the police there any faster, but I for sure hear all the bloody details about those involved. I give this background information because I want you all to know that this is not a glorious occupation. I have my moments where I feel that I truly help someone by getting them the assistance they need. But those moments pale in comparison to the times where I feel helpless to aid the people that are screaming, crying, and pleading for help. This is where my story takes place. It's a typical evening in the dispatch center. I fielded maybe 10 calls so far in the night, ranging from an elderly couple that almost burned their house down by leaving wet clothes on a heater, to the mom of a child that has fallen off their bunk bed and whacked their head. All in all, a relatively tame start to my shift. But that goes out the window when I get a call from a woman who is whispering into the receiver of her phone, telling me that she had been home all alone in her house, but now fears that someone has broken in and is walking around downstairs. Her voice is calm yet obviously frightened. She tells me her name, her address, and that she is now hidden in her upstairs bedroom as she is listening to heavy footsteps roam around the ground level of her home. She tells me that she was already upstairs with everything locked up for the evening, when about 2 or 3 minutes ago, she heard noise coming from her front door before what she equated to it being forced open. She quickly retreated to her room before closing the door, turning the light off, and taking refuge behind her bed. She also let me know that she has a gun with her and is well aware of how to use it. So there are a few things we do right off the bat. Given that this is obviously a police matter, I relay all the information that I have to units that can render aid. Female, home alone, suspected home intruder, homeowner is armed. That is what I know. What I don't know is how far away units are and what their ETA to get to the house is. I tell her that help is on its way, as I'm trained to do, and ask her more questions to glean additional information that may assist officers arriving and to keep her calm. While this is a tactic of ours, we're also taught to keep an ear out on what is happening in the background of the calls. Can we hear any noises from the intruder? Voices, bangs and crashes, anything that would indicate a struggle or an escalation of the situation. At this point, I've asked her many of the things on my list. Is there any way you can safely exit the residence? No. Is there anywhere else you can retreat to? No. Have you physically seen the intruder? No. And this is when she tells me that the footsteps sound like they're beginning to get closer, moving from downstairs to coming up the staircase. I can hear her voice tense up, rightfully so. And that's when she asks a question that would send a chill down any dispatcher's spine. If they make it into my room, can I shoot them? Not only is this a terrifying question to hear someone ask, but it puts me as a dispatcher in a very tricky spot. We are not able to give advice that would lead to the bodily harm or death of others, or potentially the caller themselves. If something happens where I direct someone to do something that leads to that, I could be held criminally liable for the act. That is where we as dispatchers often have to grapple with towing the company line, potentially protecting ourselves, versus telling someone to protect themselves at whatever cost. I have to tell the caller this. Ma'am, I cannot tell you to shoot or not to shoot. Police are on their way, though. Not directly answering this woman's dire question leaves a knot in my stomach, and I'm just praying to hear sirens in the background of this call immediately. The line goes silent for about 10 seconds that honestly could have been about 10 hours at this point, before the woman says, "They're right outside my door." I'm checking every resource that I have, hoping to give this woman good news, that help is at her door, that they just pulled up. Anything. That's when I hear, followed by a scream that I will hear ring through my ears for the rest of my life. Ma'am? Ma'am, are you still there? The phone must have been dropped because I hear rustling and movement against the open phone line. She finally responds, but now in a panic. I shot him. I shot him. It's at this point that I can hear the sounds of police sirens getting nearer. I get an update on my end that the responding officers have arrived on the scene, and I begin to give the caller the instructions that I need to ensure that the officers can make entry safely. I ask her where the intruder is. Is he still a threat? If not, can she secure her firearm and wait for the officers to come and get her? But no response. All I can hear are faint sobs. Then the line clicks dead. At this juncture, I'm trained to advise the officers as best as I can, but now that they're there on the scene, there's not much left for me to do. I take a moment to collect myself, take a few breaths, and then put my headset back on and continue my shift. Although that call left me shaken, the next set of calls are already rolling in, and that means that I too have to keep on going. I think you can see just how much this work takes from you, shift after shift. The rest of the night comes and goes. Thankfully, no more calls such as that home invasion. But even as I clock out in the morning, I'm left wondering what the outcome was. I'll tell you now, I didn't have to wonder for very long. I show up for my next shift the following evening and am met at my station by my shift manager and a police sergeant. They ask if I wouldn't mind joining them for a minute. While they didn't clearly state that it had to do with the call the night before, I internally knew that that's all it could be about. We went to the conference room of the dispatch center, and the sergeant pretty much got right into it. You fielded a call about a potential home invasion last evening at or around 2300 hours. We've already listened to the recording, but I'd like to ask you a few questions about this interaction. Okay. The caller, did they indicate that they were alone in their home? Yes. Did they say if they were expecting anyone? A visitor? Anything like that? No, they did not. Did they state if they lived alone? No, they did not. She did say that she was alone, but that was it. There were a few more questions that I can't really recall, but the sergeant finished with this one. Did you happen to ask if it were possible that the intruder was somebody she knew? Could it have been a family member or a loved one? Did anyone have a key to get in? This one threw me for a loop. We as dispatchers are not typically trained to ask questions that can be answered with an opinion as opposed to fact. So my response was, no. The sergeant finished taking his notes before looking back up at me and thanking me for my time. He looks at my shift manager, who I hadn't noticed until this moment, had his head down and seemed a bit shaken himself. Once the sergeant heads out, I give it a moment before I ask my manager if he knew what that was about. He looks at me, clears his throat, and says, "It wasn't an intruder that made it into that woman's house last night. It was her husband, who works the night shift. He had gotten off much earlier than normal. Usually, when he gets home, his wife is already asleep, so he would do his best not to wake her. Last night was no different. He walked through the front door, didn't turn on any of the lights or call out to her. When he walked upstairs to go into their room to change and get into bed with her, she shot the moment that door opened. One to the head. He didn't stand a chance." If my manager said anything else after that, I can't truly remember. It was at this point that it struck me that I was on the phone with this woman when she mistakenly ended the life of her husband. The shot, the scream, her sobs, everything replayed in my mind at that time, and it didn't stop for quite a while. I don't know what happened with that woman. I don't know if charges were ever pressed. I don't know if she was simply left to deal with this personal travesty on her own. I knew that I didn't have the capacity to follow it beyond what I learned in that conference room that day. It still lingers with me, though. It's still something that I think about just about every time I receive a call that starts out with, "I think there's somebody in my house." I don't know if therapy would help me to deal with this. I don't know if leaving this profession would help. Because no matter what I do, I still can't reconcile that feeling of knowing that I was pretty much there when someone extinguished the life of the person that loved them most. I recently received a friend request that reminded me of this story, so I'm going to share it here. This happened after I went to university, so I had to be 18. I made an effort to make friends after I moved onto campus and ended up with a few groups to hang out with, including a new girlfriend and plenty of people from my classes that I liked well enough. There was one class before lunch where it was traditional for people to go to the cafeteria afterwards to eat in pairs or in threes. I wasn't very discerning about who I'd have lunch with because I got on fine with most people from the class, and we were all trying to make an effort to be social. So when one girl, a girl named Lily, asked if I wanted to eat lunch together after class, I didn't have any reason not to go. We talked about school and that kind of thing. Nothing noteworthy, but she did ask me to get lunch with her again the next week. It pretty much became a pattern, and there wasn't exactly a way to start saying no suddenly. It was fine, but it did mean I lost the chance to eat lunch with anyone else on those days. In hindsight, I suppose that was the point. One day in class, I asked someone if I could add them on social media. This happened in front of Lily. I saw her face jerk towards me from a couple of seats over. It was such a sharp reaction that it was hard to ignore, and I still remember it. By the time I got home later that day, Lily had sent me a friend request. No friends in common. Don't know how she knew my last name. I was a bit surprised, but I guess she just dug through the university's social media pages and found me through there. It gave me a bad feeling, but surely it was fine, right? She ended up messaging me a lot and commenting on anything that I posted. I told myself that she was just awkward, and we became friends, if not close. I'd known worse people after all. She still always got me to go eat lunch with her after one of our shared classes. Other than that, though, we rarely spent time together in person. I saw her around sometimes, but I never went out of my way to hang out with her. So it was mostly online messaging and seeing each other in group settings. Coincidentally, my girlfriend was also named Lily. This was something that clearly bothered Lily, not my girlfriend, who couldn't have found it less interesting. It's a relatively common name where we're from. She occasionally hinted that she wanted my girlfriend to, quote, pick a different name, or joked about it not suiting her. She clearly didn't like my girlfriend at all, and I had an idea of why. It was a little hard to ignore at this point. Lily was starting to unsubtly hint that she had a crush on me. I tried my best not to address it, because what was I going to say? I've never known what to do when a friend makes a pass at me. I was also not interested in the least. Even ignoring the weird stuff she pulled, Lily wasn't my type at all. She tended to dress and act in a way somewhere between a 50s housewife and one of those adults who is still obsessed with Disney princesses, if you can picture that. Things took an uncomfortable turn on the day of our last shared class of the year. Instead of asking me to lunch like she usually did, Lily asked if I'd go for a walk with her. Again, I didn't exactly know how to refuse, so I said all right. Our campus was bordered by a large patch of woodland. Lily led me into the woods, and the sounds of our fellow students slowly faded away. She sat down on a log, and I joined her. She started talking about how she was going to miss me over the summer. I tried placating her, but I didn't want to be there, especially because she seemed almost on the verge of tears. I think I tried to make an excuse about having plans with my girlfriend, but before I could leave, Lily chose to kiss me without warning. It was uncomfortable to say the least. I got out of there and was happy to think that I wouldn't see her for a while. I came back to university after the summer, moving into a house with my friends. Without going off topic, there were some serious issues in my friend group. A lot of petty arguing, and worse. I broke up with my girlfriend around the start of that school year as well. And basically, the whole mess made me recontextualize things with Lily, because it suddenly didn't seem as bad. That said, I didn't want to be alone with her. We mostly talked online. She was still constantly messaging me after all. One upside of everything was that I started dating a boy. Lily was not pleased to hear that news. I think she hoped to sneak in after I broke up with my girlfriend, but as I said before, that wasn't going to happen. There wasn't a big gap between my breakup and this new relationship, so she must have thought she missed her chance to be with me. This is where the story goes bad. At this time, I was fairly active on Tumblr. I occasionally talked about my life and mostly reblogged photos and stuff. I was on there one day when something odd happened. One of the blogs I followed had received an ask with some phrases I recognized. It took a second for me to register that it was taken from my About page. That made me freeze. I read the message properly. Someone was asking this completely random person to analyze a section of text from my page, asking for their opinion on the type of person who would write it. I cannot stress how messed up it was to see people talking about me like I was a character in a book that they were trying to study. The reply was basically, I don't know, sorry. But the important thing was that the question hadn't been anonymous. It linked to someone else's blog. Obviously, I wanted to know who had taken such a bizarre interest in me. As far as I knew, no one in real life, other than my boyfriend, knew about my page. Well, no prizes for guessing who was behind it. What I found was like a shrine. She was using a fake name, but I recognized Lily all over that thing. It was this cutesy pink and red page. There were a few posts about her interests, but most of the content was focused on her primary interest, me. Most of the posts were about me. There were accounts of things that I'd recently done, as well as references to things from as far back as I'd known her. It was clear she'd been keeping tabs on me, both online and off, gathering up every scrap of information she could about my life and hoarding it here in her collection. She talked about us eating lunch together and how special our dates had been to her, as if it was anything more than acquaintances getting food after class. She talked about the time she had forcibly kissed me in the woods, but she wrote about it as if it had been mutual. She quoted lyrics from my favorite song and talked about how she'd always be there for me, no matter who else came into my life. Lots of references to loving me, quote, just the way he is, which answered another mystery about an anonymous love letter I'd received earlier that year with the same wording. It got worse though. There were a lot of posts about my boyfriend as well. Those weren't so nice. They got vicious, talking about how he didn't deserve me. He didn't know what he had. If she was with me, she'd be jealous of anyone else who came near me. So my boyfriend not being a jealous person meant that he didn't love me. It was angry and hateful. I didn't like to think about the sort of person who could write so obsessively about being fixated on me. One thing that didn't make sense at first was that the blog also made plenty of references to Lily's best friend Steven. She had never mentioned this person to me. Her posts talked a lot about Steven and how great a friend he was, and how much fun they had together, how he looked out for her, etc. I was trying to work out whether this was an online friend when one specific post made it all click. She had posted a photo and captioned it with, "Steven sent this to me. He knew I would like it, and I love it," or something like that. The problem was, the photo was taken from my own page. I hadn't sent it to her. She took it from my page and then claimed this fictional best friend of hers shared it with her, because in her head, it seems as if she had split me into two people. In our messed up fantasy life, I was both the perfect best friend who was always looking out for her, and her soulmate who was bound to end up with her when I finally got over my boyfriend and all the other, quote, easy girls that I hung out with that she made dozens of posts complaining about. Who was she complaining to? Oh, Lily had an audience. She asked open questions about me and her relationship with me and got messages back from her followers. People who took what she said at face value. I saw a bunch of random people agreeing with this stalker that my boyfriend didn't deserve me, and we were bound to break up soon so I could be with Lily, the person that I was clearly supposed to be with. She had this fake fan fiction version of my life up for anyone to share their opinion on, and she'd made herself out to be the hero of it all. I went maybe a month back into this page's history. I didn't look at everything that was there. It was just too much. So I'm not sure how long this had been going on for. I sent Lily a message confronting her about the blog. She said nothing, and I cannot stress how weird it was to have found pages and pages dedicated to me, with her talking about how she was in love with me and would make sure we ended up together, slamming my boyfriend, and building this fantasy life with two different versions of me in it that she clearly believed to be real. Then just acting like it hadn't happened. She said nothing. She didn't address it. She just changed the subject, even after I pushed. And it was like she hadn't even registered what I had said. I'd never seen anything else like it. She ultimately deleted the page, of course, or at least changed the name and hid it so I never found it again. But it wasn't the end. I wasn't going to hang out with her anymore, but we were still in classes together, and she had started to actually scare me with what she might do next. I'm kind of a paranoid person, so knowing that someone was obsessively keeping track of me for who knows how long absolutely freaked me out. The next thing she pulled was trying to seduce my boyfriend. It was an absolutely useless attempt that only made him uncomfortable. He told me about it right away. What was her plan there? Did she hope to tell me he cheated and wait for me to break up with him? Why would I want her after that? When that didn't work out for her, she tried hitting on 3 of my other friends, but none of them took the bait. She ended up dating one of my former housemates for a while, but made sure to send me messages while they were together, letting me know she'd rather be with me. No thanks. Lily made sure to stay in my life the whole time I was at university. There was a time when I tried to pull away from her, and she ended up starting numerous rumors about me and damaging a career opportunity I'd put a lot of work into. I don't know what else she did behind my back, but it made me realize it was safer to let her think she was part of my life, all the while ignoring her, rather than doing something that would cause her to get angry. After I graduated, Lily still wanted to spend time together, but I knew I didn't have to now. I made excuses about work and barely talked to her after that point. I almost entirely stopped posting on social media that I knew she knew about. Of course, she didn't give up that easily. She tried to start conversations, asked me to meet up with her, attempts that I usually ignored. I didn't like to think that she was still tracking me online, but she probably was. I don't know how, but she'd occasionally reference things I mentioned online somewhere she shouldn't have known about. The last time we had a real conversation, she sent me a message out of nowhere. We hadn't spoken at all in months, and we hadn't talked about anything serious in much longer than that. Thinking about that conversation still makes my skin crawl, but I'll summarize here what happened. At first, she asked me some questions about how long I had known I was queer. I told her some basic stuff, the kind of thing I'd tell anyone who asked. Then she changed the subject. She started talking about how would I feel about her if she was a boy, about wanting to be a boy, for me. The messages quickly became based in fetish. She went into plenty of detail about fantasies she had for the two of us. Again, we were not friends at this point. We'd never been especially close, at least not from my perspective, and we had barely spoken for years now. I can't imagine sending messages like that to even a close friend, let alone someone who barely knows you. I tried telling her not to pull this crap with me, but that's when she decided to change tactics. She sent photos of herself, followed by a bunch of messages, maybe 4 or 5 in a single minute, way too fast for me to reply before the next one arrived, basically quoting what I had told her about myself and my past earlier. She was telling me these things as if they had happened to her. She was role-playing as me. The worst part was that she seemed to believe that it was all real, that those things actually happened to her, even when she was quoting me word for word. Things I told her only hours before were now her life. It was like she was trying to absorb my history, to take it over, to make my life part of her. Yeah, I didn't talk to her again after that. I ignored all future attempts she made to talk to me, and I eventually silently deleted her from the inactive social media, which was her only real way of contacting me. I really thought she might finally move on, when, a few days ago, she sent me a friend request. It's still sitting there unanswered because I know if I delete it, she'll only send another one. At this point, Lily and I met nearly 12 years ago. This story is just the highlights, and even then, it's only the stuff that I know about for sure. A lot happened behind my back. I know it did. So, girl who spent a dozen years obsessing over me, fetishizing me, stalking me, and harassing me. Let's not meet again. The fantasy life you built for the two of us in your head is the only place you'll be seeing me anytime soon. Remembering back to high school, there was this guy that was really funny, pretty popular, and that almost everyone got along with. He didn't bully anyone, not that I can recall of, and it was impossible to not laugh when he was around. He was a genuinely goofy guy, the class clown type. He would say hi to me, try to strike up conversation, and even compliment me. Being an awkward teenage girl in an extremely cringe-worthy emo phase, I was flattered. I wasn't used to getting attention like that, so it was nice to have a guy around the school that would randomly say, "You look really cute today." I wasn't interested in him romantically at all, though. He was more of just a funny acquaintance that made me smile every once in a while. He added me on Facebook, like he did with almost all the other kids in his grade, and the grade below his, which happened to be mine. After a while, he asked me if I wanted to hang out with him after school. I contemplated it, but there was a faint voice in the back of my head saying it probably wasn't a good idea. Nothing really screaming danger, though. Just something in my gut telling me to be wary. I never took him up on his offers, even if other people would be around. He also asked my best friend to hang out after school, but she never accepted either. And we would talk about how weird it was that he would ask both of us separately to hang out with him after school, since we didn't quite fit the type of girls that he was known to date. we both agreed that we just really would rather not. Time passed, life went on, and I completely forgot about the guy. Until about a week ago, when one of my friends shared an article about a bar in the next town over that had come under scrutiny for supposedly aiding predators who had hunted there, or something to that effect. I can't remember exactly what the article said because I was more focused on something else in the piece. That guy I went to high school with was in prison for raping 2 women, and that bar was indeed his hunting ground. Word around my hometown is that they weren't his only 2 victims, just the only 2 that got justice. I left the article pinned down below, just in case anybody thinks that I'm making this up, because I definitely am not. I'd like to share with you a series of horrendous events from my childhood that we never quite got a resolution to. There were some suspects, but no one was ever brought to justice. So I guess I'll just start there. This part of the story happened roughly around 1990 during my summer break from school, but continued on for quite some time afterwards. I must have been 7 or 8. I grew up just with my mom. My dad was never in the picture, so we lived alone until I was about 12 when my mother remarried. Our secluded country neighborhood was safe for the most part, and all of our immediate neighbors were elderly, save for one couple who had a few young adult sons around my brother's age. For the most part, though, we didn't have much riffraff in the area. At first, there were only minor clues to indicate something was going on, such as things being moved in the backyard, and I guess because my mother has always been a paranoid conspiracy theorist, she had an idea that something was happening. I didn't really know this until I heard her talking about it much later after the events. She often tried to hide things so they wouldn't scare me. She even started sleeping in my room with me at night, probably because she was paranoid, but I just assumed it was because we could stay up late and watch movies together while we ate snacks. One morning after I got up, I noticed that our old wooden back door had huge chunks missing out of it, around the part where the lock and bolt goes into the door frame. It was as if someone was trying to chip away at the locked part. I showed my mom what I had discovered, not realizing why the door was damaged, and she went completely silent, pale-faced, and panicked. I could tell something was wrong, but I was much too young to understand that someone had apparently tried to break in, either during the night or while we were out. That day, my mother mended the door to the best of her abilities, and if I remember correctly, she even put a new lock on it from the hardware store. She also filed a police report, but there was nothing that they could do. When I was a kid, I had a German Shepherd named Munchie. He was this big, spoiled baby who loved raiding the refrigerator with me, but to a stranger, he was probably very intimidating. He was my best friend and a very watchful eye over me, and I still miss him to this day. For a week or two, after Mom and I would go to bed, Munchie would start pacing and whining and acting very anxious. Since we lived in such a rural place with no imminent danger, Mom would frequently let him outside by himself. So one night, when he was acting exceptionally strange, she opened the door up and let him outside alone. We didn't have central air because our house was old. We were poor, and Kentucky summers weren't really too hot anyway. At night, Mom would open up all the windows in the house, with the halfway burglar latch, of course. Since she was in my room with me, watching a movie, we had both my bedroom windows all the way up. My back window overlooked a bit of a hill, which gradually sloped into a low, wide bottom. The bottom itself was full of tall weeds and bushes. Suddenly, we heard movement in the brush of the bottom. Munchie. Then we heard him snarling, like a werewolf. Mom got up and ran to the window, but she couldn't see a thing in the darkness. What we heard next was absolutely horrifying. It sounded as if Munchie was attacking someone. He he was making those god-awful noises as if he was eating someone alive. I began to cry, terrified that something would happen to my best friend. And that's when my mom started screaming in horror for Munchie to come home. We heard what sounded like someone escape my dog's wrath and take off through the brush. Mom ran to the back door, with me right behind her, and called for Munchie at the top of her lungs until he came running back into the house. He was panting and grunting, all bristled up. I hugged him so tightly, I might have nearly squeezed the life out of him. As time progressed on, things got even worse. Being so young, I didn't know for a long time, but my mom was safeguarding the house. She even moved a tall dresser in front of my window that overlooked the hill and bottom. She tried her best, but whoever was harassing us was finding new ways to make our life a living hell. One night, my mom said she heard peculiar noises coming from the backyard. I didn't necessarily remember this, so I had to call her for details before telling this story. The sounds were coming from under the dining room windows, which overlooked the backyard. She turned on the security light in the back of the house and saw a ladder propped up against the back of our home, as if someone was trying to climb in through our windows. This incident seemed more like an empty threat than a real one, especially considering that the back door was probably a more easily accessible point. We don't know if the person thought the windows would be unlocked or what, but for whatever reason, they gave it a try. Again, she called our local police, and again, they did nothing. I should probably note that we really didn't have much law enforcement there. You probably wouldn't believe me if I tried to tell you how worthless the police were, and still are in that area. On a separate occasion, and this memory is burned into my brain because it scared me so badly, someone snuck up to my bedroom window one evening. I hate to think what their intentions might have been. Mom had drifted off to sleep, but I was quietly watching the rest of Willy Wonka. I was looking in the direction of my ominous window, the one that overlooked the bottom. So I ended up getting a good look at this big, white hand, which reached up and slapped my window screen multiple times in rapid succession. I screamed, Mom woke up, and the tormentor took off, no doubt through the brushy bottom. Now, my mom is a dog person. She absolutely adores them, and has always had lots of dogs and puppies around. We had 7 little black pups and the mother dog around this time, and they lived outside on our huge property. They had plenty of space to play, and a nice, big dog house to lay their heads at. At some point around the same time that stuff was happening, we had to be out of town for a few days. Mom had some people watching the house, and I guess she didn't really think anything horrendous would happen. Then again, she wasn't aware of how far this whole thing would go. When we came home, Mom's puppies had been killed and lined up in a row on the side of the yard, close to my window that overlooked the bottom. This was devastating. The police did little to help, although they did tell her how short to saw off her shotgun so that it was still legal, while also advising us to keep Munchie in the house. I forgot to ask, but I'm nearly positive that Mom ended up sending the mommy dog away to live at her sister's house on the other side of town. Months later, incidents were increasing in occurrence. And then, someone decided to take it way too far. Something hit the back of the house in the wee hours of the morning. Mom looked out the windows and saw nothing, at least not until the next morning. She found a stick with a charred pine knot on it. Someone had apparently lit it on fire and thrown it at our house. I assumed that they were hoping that our house would burn. And once again, don't even ask about the cops, because they did nothing. I wouldn't be surprised if they knew who the culprit was the whole time and just didn't care. Then, one day, Munchie went missing. He had gone out to the bathroom in the evening before bed, but he didn't come back immediately, like he always did. He vanished. I don't really want to go into detail about this because it breaks my heart all over again, but we found him several days later. Turns out, he had been poisoned. To be completely honest, I could keep going with the story, although it takes a lot of unbelievable turns. Not all of them are horrifying. Some are just ridiculous. But around 2009, a multiple-year-long court case began where my mom had to fight a group of her neighbors in court to keep them from stealing her property. Those events led us to believe that the people involved with that case may have had something to do with the torment we experienced for all those years. But honestly, all we can do is assume. So, to those that tormented us, I wish we could meet. But you're just some lowly coward who harasses women and children and takes some sort of enjoyment in hurting animals. This happened a few months back. I'm a sophomore in college and I was traveling down to my hometown over break. I was having some relationship issues with my stepmom, so I didn't want to stay at my dad's house the night that I arrived in my hometown. So I phoned a friend of mine from high school to ask if I could stay at his place. I knew from social media that he was still in town, and I've stayed at his place before, so I knew that there would be a place for me to stay if they would allow it. My friend, let's call him Z, seemed like a pretty normal dude. We weren't best friends or anything, but we got pretty close by the time we had graduated. We would occasionally text or hang out if I was in town, and catch up, reminisce on the times we spent in orchestra or in English class. When I called, he seemed extremely enthusiastic. This wasn't off-brand, as Z was typically a very upbeat guy. But this time, he seemed over the moon, like he had just won the lottery or was getting a brand new car. I didn't really give it a second thought at the time, and he said that I could sleep in the guest room, so I headed right over. When I got to his house, he was just as excited in person as he was on the phone. He was bringing up stuff to do like getting high and watching weird movies or playing video games. Z's parents weren't home, so he really wanted the opportunity to smoke. I was pretty tired from the drive, but since we rarely see each other, I thought a little bit about how bonding couldn't hurt. We played some Super Smash Bros., smoked a little weed, and just chatted for a few hours. It was longer than I wanted, but I was having fun, so whatever, right? By the time it was getting late, around 2 a.m., he started asking me some pretty weird questions, like if I ever wondered what it was like to kill someone, or if I thought anyone would miss me if I were gone. This along with some pretty normal questions like if I had a boyfriend, or how my parents are doing, or if I'm making any friends at school. In combination, they gave me a rather weird feeling. I was confused in the moment, but it didn't hit me until after that Z could be assessing me for something bad. The weirdness of it all made me just want to go to bed. We stopped the game and both went into the basement where his room and the guest room were. We say goodnight to one another. I go to my room and begin to get ready for bed. I'm having trouble sleeping, just typical insomnia that I've had for a while, so I stay awake for around an hour until I hear some movement outside my room. The walls down there are pretty thin, so I could hear footsteps walking past my door and up the stairs to the main floor, then back down quickly afterwards. What struck me as odd was I didn't hear the basement door open, which creaks when it does. The light didn't ever turn on, so I was confused as to what Z was doing. I heard him go back into his room, but I still had this odd feeling. Just ever since I met him this night, he seemed a lot different than he's ever been. I decided to look him up on social media and Google to see if there were anything out of the ordinary to pop up. Everything seemed normal, until I found his Tumblr, which was linked from his inactive Twitter account that I found on my Twitter contact list. His Tumblr was, well, disturbing. There were graphic drawings of mutilated bodies of both humans and animals, links to suspicious-looking websites that I didn't dare to click on, texts and posts about murdering, cannibalism, necrophilia, and torture. There were photos of guns, knives, and axes, which, after looking closely, I could tell were taken in his bedroom. The last post, one from around a week prior, was a text post from the account saying he wished that he could find someone easy to kill, like a homeless person. This is what immediately filled me with dread. I knew he was going to do something. He must have gone up the stairs to lock the door. I quietly packed my things. Luckily, I packed lightly, and opened this small window at the top of my bedroom's wall. I started desperately climbing through, and as I was pulling my legs through, he opened the door. It was dark, but the streetlight illuminated enough for me to see that he was carrying something long and skinny in one hand. Thinking back, there's no doubt in my mind that it was a knife. He didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. I just turned around, hopped in my car, and drove as fast as I could to my dad's house. I immediately blocked him everywhere and reported his Tumblr account. Not before telling the police, though. They said they couldn't do anything, as the guns were registered under his dad, and he hasn't actually done anything. Yet. Nevertheless, I told my other high school friends not to hang out with Z. Ever since then, I've been creeped out whenever I meet new people. Just the realization that someone I knew so well could, underneath the facade, be this person who could hurt me so badly, who, in a certain situation, could desire to kill me. I don't know what you're doing now, Z. I'm not sure that I want to know. But I do hope that you're getting the help that you need, and staying far, far away from me while you get it. This happened years back, but still affects me to this day. I apologize for the length of this ahead of time, but I feel like I have to tell this whole story. The summer after I graduated high school, I was still living at home. I was up late one night and was packing for a camping trip with my friends. It was unbelievably hot that evening, and I had the window open as I sat and folded clothes. It was around 2 a.m. as I remember it, and the next thing that I knew, there was a single hand coming through the gap in the screen of my window. I screamed, and the hand retreated. I was stunned, but there was a part of me that wondered if it was my younger brother pranking me. I got up and looked out the window, and just saw the figure of a man staring back at me from the darkness. I ran into my brother's room, and he was there playing video games. We called the police, who came and searched the area. They found nothing, warned me and my parents to lock the windows and doors, and then left. We were all still shaken up, and my mom had a feeling that whoever that was outside would return. It turns out that her mother's intuition was spot on. She went outside and waited on her back porch. After no more than 20 minutes, she saw a man, dressed in black, slink into her backyard along the tree line. He hid behind a tree for a few seconds and ran to another tree before hiding there, slowly working his way towards my window. My mother yelled something to him and he took off running. The police came back out again, but once more, found no trace of him. I never opened that window again, not even the curtains. My parents installed some motion detecting lights, and that seemed to be the end of that. About 6 months later, my friend and I got an apartment downtown together. We were really excited, as this was our first place on our own. The apartment itself wasn't exactly the best quality, but it was so fun to be living in the city. The downside was that it was street parking only. After a few weeks, my car was broken into. Nothing was taken, but a single rose sat on the passenger seat. It was creepy, but I vowed to remain vigilant and safe. I always tried to park close to the entrance, near the lights, but often it was difficult to get those spots, and I would have to park farther away, on some of the darker streets. Things quickly began escalating at this point. My car was broken into at least once a week. Most of the time, a flower was left, which I always threw on the ground. But one time, a pair of men's underwear was left. And even more creepily, once a bag of Tootsie Rolls. They were my favorite candy back then. This made me wonder if the person knew me personally, and I started to become suspicious of just about everyone in my circle. There was a laundry room in the basement of the apartment, and one day I went down to get a load that finished drying. As I began to fold, I realized all of my undergarments, bras, and panties were gone. Another week, I had a male friend over from school, and his tires were slashed during the visit. By the time the first letter arrived, I had already started making plans to move elsewhere. This letter described a love for me that had been going on for years. It noted things that proved whoever had sent this had been watching me, and watching me closely. I was able to arrange for another friend to take over my lease, and I moved in with a separate friend on the other side of the city. It was in a secured building and had an underground parking garage that was only accessible to tenants. I felt much more secure, and the extra money spent was well worth the peace of mind. Things were quiet for a few months, and then my roommate got a boyfriend. Most of us were immediately wary of Ashley's new boyfriend. For one, they met on MySpace after he reached out to her. Another reason was that the new boyfriend, Matt, was extremely good looking. And while Ashley was a wonderful person, she just wasn't the type that you would typically expect someone like him to date. Ashley was thrilled. She had never had a boyfriend before, and really felt like he was her Prince Charming. I thought he was weird and creepy from the beginning. Matt was on the quiet side, and always seemed to be sporting an uncomfortable, leering smile. It was difficult to carry on any sort of conversation with him because he would always make it weird with some random facts that were completely unrelated to what we were talking about. I had deleted my MySpace when the initial stalking began, but I created a dummy account to learn more about Matt. It didn't look like he really knew any of his friends in real life. There were only pictures of himself on the page, and the rest of the information listed was vague. My friends and I gently tried to discourage Ashley from seeing Matt. He technically hadn't done anything wrong, but he was just so strange. She would immediately get defensive and would shut the conversations down. Matt started to spend more time at the apartment, and I found myself finding any excuse I could to avoid coming home. One day I came home from work and found Matt on my couch, alone, drinking a beer. Ashley had been called into work, and she told him he could just hang out. I was furious because I didn't want to spend any time with him, so I grabbed a beer and a snack and headed off to my room and shut the door. About 30 minutes later, Matt knocked on my door and suggested that we watch some TV and get to know each other better because we both loved Ashley. I didn't want to, but decided that maybe I needed to give it a try. He put on a movie, and I tried to just focus on the movie because I didn't want to talk. At one point, I glanced over to Matt, and he was staring at me with a smile on his face. I snapped a "what?" at him, and he just continued smiling before saying, "I just can't believe it." "Believe what?" I asked. He said nothing and went back to watching the movie, still smiling. I had no idea what he was talking about, but the interaction had every hair standing up on my body. I excused myself and locked the door to my room. Another month or so went on, and I had managed to avoid being home for much of anything beyond sleep and showers. Matt practically lived there, and had even brought a bunch of his things into Ashley's room. I really didn't want to move again, but was beginning to look for other options. On their 6-month anniversary, I saw a huge bouquet of flowers on the table and an already open card propped up next to it. I rolled my eyes and was about to leave when I decided to see what the weirdo wrote to her. When I opened the card, my heart started beating through my chest. Without even reading the words that he wrote, I was shaking. The handwriting was exactly the same as the writing in the letter that my stalker had sent. I had kept the letter as evidence and dug it out of my desk for comparison. The handwriting was unique, yet identical. Matt was the stalker. I called the police first. As they were on the way, I called Ashley and asked her to come home. She was at work but said she would be there as soon as she could. I was terrified to tell her because I knew that she would be shattered. The police took a statement from me and actually went to Ashley's work to get more information from her. And that's when they ended up breaking the news. Apparently, Ashley called Matt and left a furious message, even though the cops told her not to say anything. And he completely disappeared after that. There was no Matt or anyone matching his resemblance at the place that he said he worked. Ashley had never been to his apartment because he said he had been staying with friends while trying to save money for a trip to Europe. His family lived out of state, and she never met a friend of his because he said that they had all had a falling out due to the fact that he was choosing to spend so much time with Ashley. These were all lies, and in the end, she was dating a stranger. We don't even know if Matt was his real name. Now, the cherry on top of this whole thing was when we went through Matt's things. He had left everything when he disappeared, and Ashley and I decided to go through everything he left. There was a duffel bag that was full of gym clothes, but in one of the compartments, there were about 10 physical pictures of me. All were taken from far away, with the exception of one while I was sleeping. The sheets were ones that I still had, so I knew that this had to have been at the current apartment before I started locking my bedroom door. A few of the pictures dated back to before the incident at my parents' house, which all but confirmed that that was him as well. 2 pairs of my missing underwear were there, and I shudder to think of what he did with the rest. A Starbucks lid with my red lipstick marks, a necklace I hadn't even noticed missing, and a few other random, sick souvenirs. The police never tracked Matt down. Around this time, I decided to accept an opportunity overseas that I had been considering and got the hell out of there. Unfortunately, Ashley and I quickly drifted apart. She had a really hard time accepting that her first love was a complete psycho. I think I had some underlying anger directed at her, maybe misplaced, for believing all of his lies and letting him into our lives. I don't know what his endgame was. Would he have tried to hurt me? Or was he simply content with being in my world? I don't think I'll ever know. Being stalked changes you. Even when I lived across the world, I looked over my shoulder everywhere I went. I still have no social media accounts attached to my real name. I'm married with children, and know deep down that Matt just moved on to torment some other poor woman. And every time I visit my hometown, I'm tense and keep a low profile. Part of me will always worry that Matt will resurface again. This is going to be a long story, so I encourage you to sit back. To give a little background information, I'm from a city in the northeast of Scotland, in the UK. What happened here didn't just affect me, but also 2 close friends, who for the purposes of the story, we'll call Debbie and Joe. We all used to work for the Virgin Megastore, and for those of you that aren't old enough to remember, Virgin was where you'd go for tapes, CDs, movies, and pretty much any form of media up until the mid to late 2000s. I started there back in 2003. Debbie joined in 2006, and Joe came aboard in 2007. For the most part, the entire staff of the store were all close friends. We were all music and movie nerds, so we shared the same interests and sense of humor. Every year over the Christmas holiday, we would take on temporary staff as extra help for the volume of customers we would get. In 2007, one of our temps was named Rory, and unlike Debbie and Joe, this isn't a pseudonym. Most of us hit it off with Rory brilliantly young guy, seemed really passionate about music, especially Pink Floyd, which was a big win with Joe, who is one of the greatest guitarists that I've ever met personally, and myself, who grew up on Pink Floyd through my parents. Plus, Rory was a budding filmmaker, and his love of movies seemed to match his love for music. So we had a lot to chat about, and became friends very quickly. It was rare to keep in touch with the work temps post the Christmas period, but Rory was an exception to this. He didn't live in the same city as the rest of us, but kept plenty of contact through text and social media, and would come through to the city to hang out from time to time. Moving forward to Christmas of 2008. By this point, Virgin Megastore had become Zavi Entertainment, and Rory came back to work with us as a temp again. Specifically, he'd be working under me. I ran the stockroom of the store, which was the busiest place at Christmas time, and had a history of not great people to help for how much work had to be done. So I was happy to be getting someone I knew would work hard, and that I could have banter with. He could be a bit annoying trying to force different live versions of the same Pink Floyd song he'd found on the internet. As I said, I love Pink Floyd, but I love a lot of other music as well. Nevertheless, I just figured, he's young, and he's passionate, but he's cool. Around this time, he started to put together a self-made Pink Floyd documentary, which he interviewed me and Joe for. And to be honest, he did a great job given the limited tools that he had. Zavi closed in February of 2009 due to the global credit crunch at the time. All the Zavi staff and Rory kept in touch. We'd all become very close working there. Fast forward to summer of 2010, we had a Zavi reunion night out, which Rory organized. Most of us that still lived in the same city managed to make it along. It was a really fun night out, and Rory stayed at my place. Rory was preparing to go to America for his second year working as a camp counselor for Camp America at Camp Wigwam in Maine, Ohio. Since Zavi closed, I'd gotten a new job doing the same thing at another entertainment retail store, and that Christmas, Rory came to work there as a temp, which I was initially fine with. Moving into 2011, Rory starts to raise red flags, although at the time, I didn't see them clearly. He claimed that while in America, he'd gotten a job helping with editing and camera work on the show Burn Notice. At the time, I was like, wow, that's cool, man. Well done. It didn't seem unbelievable, given I knew he had talent in filmmaking. To coincide with this, he claimed he was working for Camp America in Florida, which is what led him to work on Burn Notice, where it was at the time filmed. Then, when he was back in Scotland in 2011, it was time for another Zavi reunion, which Rory had to be in charge of, which bothered me, as he technically didn't work there when we closed. And like I said, he was only ever a temp anyway. I got sickened with him posting constantly on Facebook about essentially what was just some old friends going to the pub. Again, I was just like, yeah, he's young and easily excited. He's harmless though. But then another red flag was raised. Rory and another friend who shared an interest in filmmaking were talking about doing a film in the city. They spent the whole day looking at locations. And afterwards, when I spoke to Rory, he was like, yeah, we're going to do this, and this, and this, making it sound like they had some real exciting ideas. But then when I spoke to another one of my friends about it, he told me all Rory did for the whole day was ask me about my favorite directors. It was a complete waste of time. Made me think, once again, he's young and excitable and has a tendency to exaggerate, but still, he's harmless. Move on to 2012. Debbie, who I mentioned at the start of this story, became a closer figure in Rory's life. Debbie is nearly 6 feet tall, she's blonde, and the definition of a bombshell. At the time, she was one of the nicest people you could ever meet, with an amazing sense of humor. We became super close when we worked together, but it was never anything other than platonic. I always looked at her in more of a sibling way. She would come round to my place for dinner and to watch movies, and I knew all her close friends and a few family members. Herself and Rory went to the cinema a few times, and hung out afterwards. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. For now. Move on to Christmas time. Rory's back as a temp for the 3rd year in a row, and by this time, he has started to annoy the other staff. While on lunch, he'd sit and brag about all the TV shows he'd worked on during summers in the States. Burn Notice, Criminal Minds, and The Wire. Unfortunately, I didn't hear about this at the time because people knew I was friendly with him. They didn't want to seem like they were talking shit about him, as the staff in this job also got along famously. On a personal note, talking with him at work became a bit weird. He started talking to me in a really smug and condescending tone, which, given the fact that I'm 6 years older than the dude and had a hand in him getting his temp jobs every year, I didn't really appreciate it. Then, around the same time, there's another Zavi night out due. Rory, Debbie, Joe, who is now visiting from his new home in Glasgow, along with myself and a few others. The day before the said get-together, keeping in mind, I'm pissed about how Rory is behaving. I get a text from him saying, "Hey man, the plan for the night out tomorrow is to go to the pub quiz. Your favorite." Now, I don't go to pub quizzes for tedious personal reasons, and all these friends knew this. So Rory was essentially implying the rest of the guys had planned to go to something I wouldn't go to, which I didn't, as I was super pissed about that text. I kept quiet about it from the others, even though I should have known how devious he was, because, as it turns out, those guys didn't go to a pub quiz, and there was no intention to. The next day, Joe comes into the shop to speak to me since I'd missed the night out. The whole time I'm talking to him, Rory is standing next to him in a defensive stance, answering just about everything that I asked Joe, like he was Joe's spokesperson, which was infuriating. But because I was at work, I couldn't lose my shit, and Joe is happy-go-lucky. He didn't even notice what Rory was doing. Rory was obsessed with Joe because of his talents as a guitar player, to the point of it becoming unhealthy. It was around this time that Debbie started to sense I was having a problem with Rory, and it was true. Contact with him would trigger me to get anxious or angry, because I knew there was just something amiss. But Debbie and Joe were constantly fooled by his false charm, and that's why I kept tolerating him, because I loved those guys and didn't want to be the cause of any drama. In early 2013, Rory tells us that his dad had a life-threatening stroke, which he survived, but left him incredibly disabled. But this subsequently turns out to be a lie, and a tool to get sympathy from both Debbie and Joe. Moving forward to 2014, Joe moves back to town from Glasgow, into Debbie's spare room, and this is where Rory really starts to phase me out from the group. Despite having recently hung out with me and me having to put up with him at my place, which I had done several times over the years to this point, he takes Debbie, Joe, and another ex-Zavi friend to 3 Prince shows around the country. Initially, I was super pissed, but in hindsight, I was relieved. It was Rory that paid for all the tickets for those gigs, which was another red flag. I have to point out that when he wasn't working with me as a temp over Christmas, or in America over the summer working for Camp America and various TV shows, he put on that he was a freelance photographer and video editor, which would be fine, but he didn't have a website, a Facebook page, or anything else as far as I could see to contact him to do said work. Taking that into account, and the fact that he's throwing cash to go to concerts around the UK, I was concerned about where his money was coming from. Following the Prince gigs, I had blocked him on all social media, as his posts and comments on other people's posts were just annoying, constantly undermining people on what they're saying, or arguing with folks having a different opinion from him. Debbie took issue with me blocking him and stuck up for him, which in hindsight shows that she'd been groomed by him and had rose-tinted glasses on whilst looking at him. I caved and got back in touch with him, even though I know I should have walked away from them all. But like I said before, I dearly loved Debbie and Joe and didn't want to lose their friendship, even though I knew deep down there was something bad about Rory. Throughout 2014, Debbie and Rory continue to get super close. Anyone that didn't know them and just saw the Facebook pics would think they were a couple. Over the next 2 years, my contact with these guys started to drift. Rory would come around to my place for a bit, and then when leaving be like, "I'm away up to Darling Debbie's. I would invite you, but you're not one of the 3 amigos." This became a running phrase for him, but a lot of the time, I learned that he was actually never going to see Debbie. He came to my place to stay the night once, saying he needed to catch a flight to the States in the morning to a video editing job. Then it would turn out he was just going back to the village he lived in, to his mom's house. Eventually, I walked away quietly. I took Debbie, Joe, and Rory off of my newsfeed and decided to make any Facebook post that I made hidden from them. I figured if I see any of them on the street, I'll be polite and just go my separate way ASAP. I started to investigate Rory's claims about his time in America, though. I relayed them all to a friend and his flatmate, who he himself had lived in America for a long time. They both told me, "Nah man, there's no way he could be doing all that shit." Which is true. If you go to America to work for Camp America, that's all you're allowed to do. And with a bit of research, I found the camp Rory actually worked at, proving he never did Camp America work in Florida. During this time, I had friends who would still follow him on Facebook, just out of intrigue. They would ask me, where is his money coming from? Rory was going to stadium and arena concerts around the UK at least once a week. Some of the gigs cost as much as £200, not to mention travel costs and accommodation. I knew that something was up. I knew that he wasn't involved in drugs. He would claim he made money from YouTube, but his channel barely had any subscriptions. And plus, all of his videos were of copyrighted material, so there was no way he was making money on that. I did wonder if he was making money from editing. He was avoiding paying tax. That's the only thing I could think of. Believe me, if I could have afforded a private detective to investigate this guy, I would have gladly done that. During all of this time, though, Debbie and Joe are hanging out with and posting how great he is on Facebook, despite the fact that I found Rory had a second Facebook account where the profile pic was of him and Debbie. This was his secret account, and I took a screenshot to show Debbie, but she was just like, "Oh, isn't that his American account?" Sorry, Debbie, but you were really f***ing stupid. Now let's fast forward to October of 2018. By this point, I've severed pretty much all contact with Rory. I've missed Debbie's wedding the previous year, where Rory was a bridesman, and I hadn't seen Joe in a good while either. I'm back at work after lunch for about 5 minutes, when my friend who is on her lunch and in the staff room comes running through to where I am. "Hey, have you heard Rory was in court?" Which, in and of itself, was initially shocking. I was like, "What, for tax evasion or copyright infringement?" "No," she said, "for making videos of little kids." You see, between January and November of 2017, he was pretending to be a girl online using YouTube and Omegle to groom young boys. Once I was told what he'd done, I was in an adrenaline-fueled rage for the next 17 hours or so. Just so pissed off that I'd been right about him being a bad guy. I just couldn't prove it. I knew my friends had been duped. Not to mention all those poor kids that were abused by him. As for his expensible income, I really think he was selling the videos he was making on the dark web for Bitcoin profit. He was the first person ever to mention the dark net to me, but in a way of like, oh, never go to the dark net. Rory ended up pleading guilty and got 3 years and 9 months, along with a 5-year sexual harm prevention order, and he'll be on the sex offenders register for the rest of his life. I want to thank you for listening to this story. It's helped me a lot to get it off my chest. I'm still in touch with Joe, although he's a super busy guy these days. Debbie, unfortunately, I'm not in touch with now. I know she was mortified by the revelations, but she's happy and married, so I'm just glad she saw the truth eventually, even though it took something so heinous to do so. Alright, so this story takes place a few years back. I was maybe 16 or 17 years old at the time. I'm 22 now. I used to work at a well-known fast food restaurant. I typically had to work the closing shift since I had school earlier in the day. So by the time I got home, it was usually around 11:30 p.m. I had my own car at this time, and when I got off of work, I used to like to sit in my car, recline the driver's seat back, listen to music, and just chill out. I used to do this because I have helicopter parents, so this was the only real alone time I got without being hovered around. Well, one particular night, I was exhausted. I got stuck with the slow closers, so I got home a little later than normal. I started up my normal routine of sitting in my car, but instead of listening to music and scrolling through my phone, I leaned back and closed my eyes. I didn't fall asleep or anything. I was just listening to myself breathe while taking in the silence of my own company. I don't remember how long I was lying back with my eyes closed, but suddenly I bolted up and saw my mom with an angry face waving frantically at me. She was gesturing at me to come to her immediately. I sighed and hurried out of the car towards her. I would like to add that my parents like to drink, so she was pretty inebriated when I approached her. She grabbed me by the shoulders and hissed, "Who's out there with you?" Confused, I shook her off. "No one, Mom. I was just sitting in my car by myself before I came in." I remember feeling a little annoyed because I thought I was going to get in trouble, but her face soon turned from angry to concerned. "What?" "Someone was out here. They were looking in at you through your window. I came outside because I had a funny feeling, and when they saw me, they just took off into the neighbor's yard." She was slurring her words together terribly and was visibly shaking. Being the teenager that I was, I just rolled my eyes and took her inside. At that moment, I just thought she was a drunk, overprotective parent who got worried that I wasn't inside the house at my normal time. The next morning rolls around. I do my normal school routine, kiss my parents goodbye, and as I'm unlocking my car door, I notice something that stops me dead in my tracks. I felt a cold sweat creep up on me, with a chill sliding down my spine. A forehead and 2 forearm prints were on my driver's side window. I never sat in my car after work again after that. I think about it from time to time, wondering about what would have happened had my mother not come outside to check where I was. Whoever that was that person looking into my car to break into it? Did they notice me completely defenseless and were trying to scare me? I have no idea, but I'm glad that I never found out. We once had a family friend named Ron. Ron was weird, vulgar, and broken. Unfortunately, like many men in the military can be. We knew he had a sordid past, and we knew his upbringing was strange to say the least. But overall, he seemed like a harmless man. My husband Ben went to the same post-boot camp school as Ron. He and a handful of boys were bonded by the conditions and even higher-ups while attending school. Ben married me while on leave. We've been together a long time and known each other much longer than that. Eventually, we moved into an apartment together at his duty station in Southern California. It was wonderful. Ron would come around occasionally and spend weekends with Ben. Sometimes he'd even sleep in our home, on the sofa or on an air mattress in the living room. Eventually, we moved to a larger house on the military base, and Ron had to deploy to Japan. It was a long 6 months. Life went on normally without him. Friends came and went. This isn't a particularly unique situation. Ultimately, Ben's turn to deploy would come. It was hard to cope, but fine. We said our goodbyes, smooched, and he was off to strengthen his sea legs for the next 6 months. When Ron returned to California, just 1 week after Ben deployed, he wanted to pick up a box of his things from our home we had tucked away for safekeeping for him. I was excited to see the familiar face. He picked up his things, shared a little small talk, and left. Nothing strange at all, honestly. Knowing he was back from his journey and many of his friends were deployed with Ben, I extended some kind and friendly words over Facebook Messenger occasionally, wishing him well, being polite. Unfortunately for the both of us, he mistook my kindness as romantic gestures. One night, around 2 a.m., Ron called me via Facebook's calling feature. Concerned for him, I answered. I thought the worst. Had he become depressed? Maybe suicidal? I can't in good conscience deny a listening ear to someone who maybe needed it, especially someone my husband is somewhat fond of. The conversation started somewhat normally, as normal as a strange, unwarranted 2 a.m. call could be. He was loud, possibly drunk, and sounded desperate for conversation. He rambled on for a while, then admitted to me that as a child, he had had a sexual relationship with his younger stepsister. He talked in a lot of circles, but a few statements that stood out to me were, "I just can't trust myself around women, especially alone. I've always liked you. I think you're hot, and I remember the way you looked in your bikini at the beach." During this conversation, where I should have just hung up on him, I made several attempts to keep the content friendly and uplifting, assuming that he was having some sort of episode. It was all horrible, and it made me feel disgusting. He then told me that he was near my house, at another girl's house, I assume with some poor guy's awful cheating wife. He said she wasn't really anything to him, and he wanted to come over to my house. He knew that Ben was an ocean away, and that I was all alone at home. I told him explicitly to not come, and that's when he hung up on me. I panicked and closed all of the first floor windows and doors, making sure that they were all locked. I turned off the lights as well. I took my dog and cat up to my bedroom and locked that door too, wedging pieces of furniture into the door to create a barricade of sorts. Lo and behold, he showed up. He walked all around my house, pulling on the doors, calling my phone, messaging me horrible things. I screamed for him to leave both on the phone and through my upstairs window. It was really a nightmare realized. I could get in if I really wanted to, he messaged me. A clear threat, in my own opinion. I called the police, then I called my neighbor, a big Navy doc, who I feel that I owe my life to. After being chased off by my neighbor and having long talks with PMO, NCIS, and my neighbors, I received a protection order against Ron. I'm disappointed there wasn't any brig time for the fucker, but I'm pleased I've documented evidence in case he ever tries to contact me or my husband again. You never really know someone. I guess that's the moral of this story. Stay safe, friends, and exercise your right to bear arms if you so choose. At the time of this event, I was on a job where I had to drive site to site and do a small upgrade to the shelving at every CVS pharmacy in California. I'm about a month into the contract, and I've got over a 100-mile drive through the redwoods to my next location. As I'm driving along, I notice that I smell a slight funk on myself. If I can smell it, it'll be 100 times worse for the client. I need to figure out how to get to a shower and change clothes before arriving at the next location. At this point, I'm about 40 miles deep on this isolated stretch of highway through the giant redwood forest when I see a sign for a camp at the next exit. I take the turn off to see if they have a shower. I pull into this really small camp that has about 15 spots all tight together in a circle. It's actually a pretty awful camp, but it's deserted and they have a shower. Perfect, I think to myself. I grab a towel and a change of clothes and head off to the bath building. As I approach, I can hear water running. I get to the building and there's someone in one of the stalls taking a shower. This, in and of itself, pretty weird. Camp is deserted. No cars, no tents. It's the middle of winter, and we're miles and miles away from civilization. Who in the world could be in there? It's got to be a pot farmer, right? Maybe a homeless dude? Are there meth labs in the redwoods? I'm not quite spooked by it, but my instincts are telling me that this is very weird. I decide to go ahead and use one of the showers a few stalls down from him. I'm comforted that the doors are thick metal with a big strong bolt lock. The showers themselves run on quarters. Seeing this, I chuckle to myself, thinking, nice, California. I take off my clothes and slide some quarters into the slot, and the water immediately turns on. A second later, I hear, oh no, I must have stolen this guy's hot water. I feel awful, but I can't shut it off. The water instantly runs when the quarters go in. Nothing I can do, so uneasily, I step under the water, wondering what's going through the other guy's head. But I'll tell you, I don't have to wait long to find out. I'm about a minute into my shower when, bam! There's a huge smash against my metal shower door, followed by him, whoever it is, screaming. Bam! 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 This dude is trying to kick my door in. I'm petrified. I get out of the shower and stand by the door dripping wet and naked with my fists up in case he gets in. I can't put into words how uncomfortable I felt about the concept of fighting naked. I kept thinking I should try to put my pants on real quick, but I couldn't bring myself to do it, because if the door gave way while my pants were still around my ankles, I would get absolutely destroyed. I also thought about the implications of fighting someone miles and miles from the next human being. What are the stakes? I've been in more than a handful of bar fights and even enjoyed boxing with my friends, but there was never any real danger. If someone was getting hurt, everyone breaks it up. Is this guy going to stop fighting if he wins? Is this to the death in his mind? I'm so scared that now I'm near panicking, but I try to control my breathing and give myself the best possible chance at coming out of this. After what felt like an eternity of him trying to get in, even though it was probably no more than a minute or two, he stopped screaming and banging. I call out to him, "Hey man, I'm sorry. I'll give you some more quarters." There's no answer. I wait a few more minutes and finally relax a little. Phew, he's got his wits about him. I resume my shower thinking about how weird this is and wondering if he'll be waiting for me. Then my thoughts go to my truck. I've got a few grand worth of tools in there. I literally cannot afford to lose them. I'm sure that he's in it. Soaking wet, I jump out of the shower once more, throw my pants on, slam open the stall door, and go running out towards my vehicle. As I turn the corner of the building towards the parking area, at nearly a full sprint, I'm so relieved to see that he's nowhere around. He must have slunk back to wherever he hides in the wilderness. And all I can think to myself is thank God. Dear homeless, hippie, meth lab crazy person, please chill. I'm going to start this off by saying that my story involves a very serious topic, and I just wanted to give you a heads up before we got too far in. My mom was one of the intended victims of the pillowcase rapist in Florida. This man literally terrorized all of South Florida in the 80s and is thought to have assaulted at least 45 women at knife point. One woman was attacked shortly after Christmas. She screamed when she saw an intruder with what appeared to be an ice pick break into her house. He quickly put his hand over her mouth and knocked her to the floor. He stabbed her in the abdomen before telling her that if she screamed again, that she would be no more. He led her into a bedroom and pushed her onto the bed. He initially covered her face with a blanket and then a pillow as he assaulted her. At one point, she told him she couldn't breathe. and he callously told her to shut up. Shortly after he disappeared into the night, she called the police. A rape kit was done, but police weren't sure who the culprit was. They had chased down thousands of leads and distributed over 1 million flyers, trying to track this man down. After this, and many other attacks were reported. They even made a clay bust of him at one point. He had been stalking my mom for God knows how long. After the incident, I remember hearing that police had found porn magazines tossed in the garbage can alongside our fence, and footprints from there, over the fence, and down the road. The night he planned on committing his attack, unbeknownst to him, my mom and I took a last-minute Greyhound bus to Michigan to visit my grandparents. When he broke into the duplex we lived in and didn't find us there, he decided to visit the neighboring duplex instead. That's where a family friend, Janet, lived. She and her husband Freddie were friends of my mom and dad, and I played with their daughter Amy on several occasions. What the rapist didn't know is that Janet knew judo. I don't recall how he got in, but presumably, like he had with our apartment, he had broken into the place via a window above our couch. He left his muddy footprints as a souvenir. They called him the pillowcase rapist because he would cloak the victims' heads in a pillowcase or other fabric. Alternatively, he would sometimes just put it on himself to elude discovery of his identity, which is what he did in this case. Because Janet knew how to defend herself, however, she was able to unmask him and avoid being assaulted herself. The man took off, and she immediately called her husband Freddie. At that time, Freddie and my dad happened to be at a local bar that they frequently stopped at after a hard day's work. As soon as they heard what happened, they tore off down to our place, and Janet called the police. Police had just beat them there long enough to put up the crime scene tape and find those nudie magazines. They found other evidence too. The broken window, footprints, showing he had intended the victim to be my mom, and that Janet was just a potential crime of opportunity. It gives me chills to think that he knew I would be with her, and what his plan was for that terrified me. To my knowledge, all of his other victims were completely alone. I was only 5 at the time. The police were hopeful that they could put an end to this because it was the first time anyone had seen this man's actual face, thanks to Janet. They were able to make a composite sketch, and it was all over the news. Surely, someone would recognize him. But as the time went on, and leads didn't pan out, the hope of catching him dwindled further with every year, and then every decade. It's a story my mom, dad, and I would revisit from time to time, and once in a while, we would look online to see if anything ever had come of it. Each time, the answer would be no. That is, until a few years back. I was watching the news as I typically do, especially at that time, early 2020, as news of the virus was coming out. We live in Michigan now, so the last thing I ever expected to see was a story involving the pillowcase rapist, and that he had finally been caught. I was floored. After all this time, he was finally caught because his son was arrested for domestic assault and had to submit DNA. The investigators got a partial match to the pillowcase rapist and were able to deduce the actual rapist must have a familial link. They located the suspect, Robert Eugene Kohler, and followed him. They were eventually able to gather several items he had touched so they could obtain his DNA. And lo and behold, it was a match. Thank God they actually captured this man when they did. Sadly, he was already on the sex offender registry from an incident in the 90s. This was prior to DNA being taken in cases like that. When they arrested him, they found several safes filled with treasures he had taken from his victims, like necklaces, undergarments, and even a nail file. What makes the situation even colder was when they found him, he was in the midst of building a dungeon underneath his house, one that was already partially completed. Thankfully, that construction project was never completed. Plus, he's no longer on the streets, and I believe he's well on his way to having to answer for all of his terrible crimes. This happened around Christmas in 2019, when I was 26, and it sticks with me to this day. I've thought about sharing this many times, but I was never sure if it was scary enough. I guess you decide. My then boyfriend, now husband, and I decided to meet for dinner at a Christmas market here in Switzerland. He would pick up our dog from doggy daycare, and I would get there after work. Some things that are good to know. At that point, we'd had our dog for about a year. He's named Bean. He's a medium-sized dog, and before he made his way to Switzerland, he was a street dog in Italy. He was about 2.5 years old at that time, and he loved and still loves to get all the attention he can get. Also, Christmas markets are incredibly busy here, especially after work. People will meet there with their friends to eat dinner and drink mulled wine. When we got to this Christmas market, we realized that it was way too busy to walk through with a dog, and I sent my boyfriend off to get my favorite street food, malawak, while I waited at the edge of the market with Bean. Now, Bean likes to greet everyone who looks at him, and by that point, I had gotten used to talking with strangers because my dog wanted to meet them, so I wasn't too concerned at first when a dude came up to me. Full transparency, I don't remember word for word what was said. I'm not even sure what language this happened in. I do remember that Bean happily greeted this guy, trying to stand up against him and licking his hands. The guy asked for his name and what breed he is, and I told him that Bean is a pincher mix. That's when the situation started to turn. The man insisted that he must be a Basenji. How could I say he's a pincher? All of a sudden, this man switched. There's no better word to explain it. He grabbed Bean's leash and said, "I'll go now," and just tried to walk off with my dog. Thankfully, I had a firm grip on his leash. I was incredibly confused and flustered, and just stammered that he wasn't going to take my dog. This man got increasingly more angry with every second that I didn't let go of the leash. I loudly told him to leave me alone, and Bean started to bark at the man. I've never seen Bean this angry and scared at the same time. Thankfully, this man let go of the leash and slipped off into the crowd. I was left standing there, a dumbfounded mess, with a mess of a dog as well. Bean was barking and shaking, so I knelt down to settle him, holding him and talking to him. My boyfriend was still somewhere in the crowd, waiting for our food. After a short while, a woman walked up to me and told me not to put my heel on the floor, as she'd seen someone put a firecracker there. I don't quite know the name for this type of firecracker. They're small and usually thrown at the floor to make a little boom sound upon impact. Someone had placed them under the heel of my shoe so that it would explode when I put my heel down to get up. Now, I don't know what's worse. Was it the same guy that tried to steal Bean? Or was it someone else who saw a distressed dog and thought, "Wow, let's scare this dog just a little bit more"? I think the worst thing for me was that apart from that woman who warned me, no one helped me when I was harassed by a weird guy, even though I loudly told him to go away. And there were plenty of other people standing very close, just watching. Bean was actually the one who scared off the guy in the end. Thankfully, the events of that evening had no lasting impact on Bean. He still loves to greet strangers. I still remember this whole thing though, and I don't think that it's something that I'll ever forget. When I was in the 3rd grade, I made a friend named Nicholas, Nicky for short. We were both on the quieter side compared to our classmates, and we both shared a love for pudding cups. One day at school, Nicky forgot his lunch at home, so I told him that he could have my pudding cup. That's how we became friends. From that moment on, we shared my pudding cups almost every day. The other kids in our class used to tease us, accusing us of having crushes on each other, and chant that horrible Kissing song all the time. It had become customary for Nikki and I to separate ourselves from the other kids at recess and at lunch. We had a big tree we would always meet under, in the morning, at recess, and for a few minutes after school before our parents came to pick us up. Nikki himself lived with his older sister and single mother. He tried explaining the concept of a divorce to me once, but in my 8-year-old mind, it didn't make sense that his parents weren't together, happily married. As you can imagine, my parents were married, and my home life was the epitome of an adoring, nuclear family. Imagine Full House, except with a mother who hadn't passed away, and a couple of cousins instead of uncles. I can't recall a single moment in my childhood where I felt unloved or uncared for in any way, but I soon realized that that was the rarity. During one of mine and Nikki's morning visits to the tree, as we had cleverly nicknamed it, he invited me to his birthday party. He excitedly unzipped his backpack and withdrew an invitation card made of blue construction paper. There was a hand-drawn tree on the front, 2 little kids of approximately mine and Nikki's size and coloring, and a home address scribbled inside. To this day, I still have it. When the bell rang, he and I ran inside with the rest of the kids, and I waited all day for him to give out the rest of his birthday invitations, but he never did. I was the only one he had invited. Because the other kids teased us so much, my 8-year-old mind had chalked it up to the conclusion that he didn't want any bullies there, and had therefore invited his only friend, me. Suffice to say, I was both flattered and happy. I gave the card to my mother later on in the evening. She smiled and said, "How cute," and very quickly gave me permission to go. It was my first non-family birthday party. The next day, I went to the store with my mother and older brother, and we picked out a birthday present for Nikki. He and I were heavily into Transformers, so we got him a tiny Transformer, and I wrapped it up in blue wrapping paper all by myself. His birthday was on the following Saturday. My mother dropped me off at Nikki's house, briefly speaking with his mother in the kitchen, discussing pickup times and how fast they're growing comments, before kissing me on the forehead goodbye. Because Nikki, his sister, and I were the only ones there, we decided to play a couple of board games and then tag when it wasn't raining outside anymore. We were in the backyard, and it got to be a little sunny afterwards. Nikki and I fell deep into our dramatic reenactment of the latest and most exciting Power Rangers episode to date, that we had seen at least. His sister, a preteen at the time, went inside for a minute to, quote, check something, which Nikki later revealed to me was a code phrase she used when she wanted to talk to the cute neighbor boy on the phone. Inside the kitchen, his mother was cooking and keeping an eye on us through the window. It was only as we went inside to eat that I realized there were no decorations. In fact, there wasn't anything to signify that it was Nikki's birthday at all, except for the homemade chocolate cake. I had loosely gathered that Nikki's family didn't have a lot of money, and that maybe was the reason that he went to school without lunch so often. But I never really asked, and Nikki never really said anything. Not that an 8-year-old would do either of those things. We went down to the basement after we cut the cake and took a couple of photos, where there was a tiny TV and a Super Nintendo system. We played video games for roughly 10 minutes before there was a loud knock at the door. Nikki stopped the game and jogged up the basement stairs to answer the door, eventually screaming, "Dad, I thought you said you couldn't come." He was very excited, understandably so, considering how rarely he saw his father and what a big occasion it was in his life when he did. He would always tell me about it at school, that his cool, fun dad came to visit and took him for a ride around the block on his motorcycle. For a while, I'll admit I wasn't sure if I believed his dad actually owned a motorcycle, but when Nikki came down to introduce me to his dad, I followed them outside into the front yard and saw a big, black Harley parked in the driveway. There were 2 helmets, one for his dad and one for him. I was instantly jealous My own father drove a minivan and wore polo shirts and cargo pants almost religiously. Nikki's dad, however, was the complete and total opposite of mine. He wasn't suburban at all. In fact, he looked like a character out of The Outsiders. Right away, I thought he was cool. And right away, I wanted to fit in with them. I should note that Nikki and I came from different ethnic backgrounds. He was white. I was not. Because I went to school with a majority of white kids and lived in a town with a majority white population, I found it very difficult to fit in sometimes. That was part of the reason I had grown so close to Nikki so quickly. He was pretty much the only kid in school who gave me the time of day. And I, him. The other kids didn't like me because I looked different, and they didn't like Nikki because he wore old, faded clothes. He was raised on a modest salary. His mother had a few jobs if I remember correctly. She was a waitress, a grocery store clerk, and a part-time janitor. For a single mother with 2 growing kids, a house, and a car that was always breaking down, she was really quite optimistic. I liked her a lot. She was always nice. Even when she caught one of the bullies in school shoving Nikki to the ground, she was nice. So when she wasn't nice to Nikki's father, and when she pulled him aside to ask him to leave the party, I couldn't help but wonder why. My mother picked me up soon afterwards, and I made a pact with Nikki that I would come over again very soon. Because my mother had finally met his in person and spoke with her, I was allowed to come over and play now. Before that, she would always tell me, not until I meet his mother. From that point on, I went over to Nikki's house 2 or 3 times every week. Sometimes his mother would be there. Sometimes his older sister would be there. One of them was always there to look after us and make sure we didn't get up to any trouble. We would usually just go down to his basement and play video games, or when the weather would allow it, we would ride bikes in the cul-de-sac and jump on his tiny trampoline. He was always better at flips than me, and I kind of resented him for it. One time he tried to teach me how to front flip, and I nearly landed on my head. The second I got to my feet, I ran away and started crying, mostly due to embarrassment. I wanted Nikki to think that I could hang, but I couldn't really do any of the cool things he could. My own parents thought trampolines were too dangerous and forbade me from jumping on Nikki's. I used to do it anyway, though. Kids will be kids. Nikki thought I was cool, though, and to get my crybaby ass to feel better, he admitted he was a little jealous of me. He said he was jealous of my new clothes, my new bike, and just everything new that I had. That was the first time he opened up to me about being less privileged. The Super Nintendo in his basement was an old gift from a cousin who lived in the next town over, but it barely worked half the time. That was probably why his cousin gave it away in the first place. We sat in his basement for a few minutes, talking about all the little reasons we were jealous of each other. And then his sister came down to say she was going to the mall with her friends, but that their dad was coming over to look after us. Their mother was at work that afternoon. For whatever reason, Nikki was shocked to hear his dad was coming over. I took it as a surprise visit and ran outside with Nikki when we heard the motorcycle pull up. Indeed, his dad was there, and he also had a late birthday present for Nikki in his hands. It was a box, roughly the size of his head, and it was wrapped in newspaper. When we went inside to open it, he made Nikki promise not to tell his mother what he got him. Apparently, his mother didn't want Nikki to get a present from his dad, but his dad bought him a present anyway. Nikki readily nodded, so I followed his lead. I watched Nikki tear the newspaper to shreds, revealing a brand new Polaroid camera within. Nikki had no idea what it was at first, looking to his dad for answers, before I excitedly said, "A camera! You got a camera!" I could tell Nikki felt embarrassed that he didn't know right away what it was, but he was also just so happy that he got something. He brushed the embarrassment aside, and we opened the box to play with it. His dad taught us how to use it, and explained how it worked to us. He pointed it at Nikki and snapped the first photo, flapping it in the air afterwards, and then showing us the final product. It was very cool to me that the photos came out right away. My family had a camera too, but we had to wait for the photos to get developed at a store. By the time that would happen, I'd always forget and lose interest. But Nikki's new Polaroid camera printed out photos right away. Nikki loved it, and I loved it, and his dad really seemed to love it too. When his dad pointed the camera at me next, I smiled like a dork, and we all laughed at the photo after. My front teeth were missing, and I looked like that photo that we all have of our childhood self that makes us embarrassed when we look back at it. Nikki and I traded our photos after. He kept the photo of me, and I kept the photo of him. We said we'd be friends for as long as we kept the photos of each other intact, so I took extra good care of mine. Now that we had a new toy to play with, I was always asking to go over to Nikki's. Because I lived in a house with so many other family members and relatives, I felt lost there sometimes. When I went to Nikki's, I felt more like I belonged, and it was always much quieter there too. It was the mid-90s at this time, so parents were less strict with their young children, and mine allowed me to spend hours at Nikki's as long as his mother was okay with it. And she always was. She loved having me around, because she knew how happy it made Nikki to have a friend to hang out with. My mother would frequently send me to Nikki's house with some sort of dish or snack, and she even invited Nikki's family to my house for dinner once. My family really liked his, and I think my older brother had a tiny crush on his older sister, but she was all about neighbor boy, so tough luck, bro. For this reason, I was allowed to go to Nikki's house almost every day now. He didn't live too far from my house either. His house was one of the few places I knew how to get to, apart from my own. There were times when I would go straight to his house from school, and times where he would come over to play with me at mine. The latter happened rarely, as we both preferred his house. Mine was just way too crowded. One day at school, Nikki told me his dad had come over the other night and got mad at him for not taking any new photos with the Polaroid he got for his birthday. Both Nikki and I loved the Polaroid, and we thought it was very cool the first few times that we played around with it. But as most kids do, we eventually lost interest, and Nikki sort of just tucked it under a blanket in the basement and forgot about it. I guess his dad didn't like that very much, so Nikki asked me if I'd help him take photos for the next time his dad comes to visit. In fact, he said his dad specifically requested that I be in the photos. I found this perfectly normal as an 8-year-old. I figured Nikki's dad wanted us to have fun with the camera and immortalize our friendship, make a scrapbook or something. Up until this point, Nikki's mother and sister still had no idea he even had a camera. I agreed I would come over soon and we would take a bunch of silly photos. But Nikki forgot to mention one thing to me. He forgot to mention that his dad would be there. It was the same story as last time. His mother was working, his sister was at the mall with friends, presumably with money their dad gave her, and their mother had no idea any of this was going on. I went over there after school, and I noticed the motorcycle parked out front. Nikki didn't seem surprised to see it, but something about his mood was off that day. I figured it was because he got in trouble the last time he saw his dad. Because it was raining a little, we went inside to hang out in the basement, where I thought we would play on the Super Nintendo for a bit. But that wasn't the plan at all. Nikki's dad was in the basement. He greeted me with a big smile and asked us how school was, if we did anything fun at recess, what kind of things we learned in class. The usual questions a parent would ask. I thought nothing of it, as my parents would often ask me the same questions. Eventually, Nikki's dad said we should start taking photos, so I obliged. I smiled widely for the camera, but instead of pressing the button and laughing at the photo like we had done the other day, Nikki's dad tutted at me and said I should try to look prettier. I had no idea what he meant by prettier, so I just smiled a little smaller and held it for a second before he corrected me again. As you can imagine, he kept at it, nitpicking at me until I let my hair down, telling me to pinch my cheeks before every photo to make sure they were flushed, rosy, and pretty. This whole time, he hadn't taken a single photo of Nikki. Because it's been decades, and because I've somehow managed to block most of this out, I'm not entirely sure what led up to it, but Nikki's dad eventually convinced me to start taking articles of clothing off. First my jacket, then my socks, and then my cardigan. And then he asked Nikki to get in the frame. The whole time Nikki had been standing off to the side, not saying a word, and not looking at me either. It was like he felt something was wrong, but he was too afraid to say it. What ended up happening is exactly what you think. First, Nikki was told to hold my hands, then hug me, then put his face really close to mine, and then he was told to kiss me on the mouth. His dad snapped photos of it every step of the way, asking Nikki questions like, "Isn't she pretty? Don't you think she's pretty, Nick? Do you want to take her on dates?" It was a whole lot of that and a whole lot of touching. The whole time, I stood completely still, not really sure of what was going on. Had any other boy been there with me, I'm not sure I would have remained so calm. But because it was Nikki, I felt somewhat safe. I didn't feel like we were doing anything wrong. The kiss was gross to me, but everything else I was mostly okay with. We stopped pretty quickly after that kiss though. Not because his dad wanted to, but because I had to go home. My mother came to pick me up. Usually, it would be my brother that did so. That way he could talk to Nikki's sister a little bit. But he had basketball practice that day, so my mother came instead. For some reason, Nikki's dad didn't go up to answer the door. He sent Nikki to do it, and I took a second to grab my jacket and sweater and put them on. During this time, while Nikki's dad and I were alone in the basement, he said he would come back to take more pictures one day, and that I should wear makeup next time. I didn't have any at 8 years old, but I didn't tell him that. I just collected my things and got out of there to go home. I saw my mother at the door and she hugged me, asking how my day was. And then suddenly, everything was normal again. For me, anyway. I glanced back to wave bye to Nikki, but he had already closed the door. The next day at school, he completely ignored me. I went to the tree and waited there all morning and all recess, and for an extra 15 minutes after school, but he wasn't there. I saw him in class, so I knew he was at school. He just didn't want to hang out with me for some reason. This carried on for the rest of the week, until one day, my mother got a phone call from Nikki's mother. I was in the living room watching wrestling with my brother, and I vividly remember my mother's smile vanishing as she listened on the phone to whatever Nikki's mother was saying. I remember asking what was wrong, if Nikki was sick, but my mother didn't say anything to me. She just nodded and listened and nodded and listened, face draining of color, as though she had seen a ghost. Later, she asked to speak with me in my bedroom and asked me very clearly, "Sweetie, who was there at Nikki's house the other day? Was it his sister Angela or someone else?" As soon as I said someone else, her eyes became watery and she asked what had happened. I was vague on details because I wasn't really sure what had happened myself. It was such a blur to me at this time. The only thing I was worried about was Nikki and why he had been ignoring me. Because I didn't want him to be more mad at me and ignore me for longer, I kept quiet about the camera, just saying that Nikki's dad watched us play and told me I was pretty. The last part was apparently enough to set off a huge red flag in my mother's mind. She gave me another hug, told me she wasn't mad at me, and that everything would be okay really soon. So, this is what happened. Apparently, Nikki's mother had found the camera, asked Angela about it, and then Nikki, quickly learning that their dad had been coming over without her knowledge. The rule was he could only visit when she was home, but the past few times, she wasn't. The next day, I found Nikki under the tree at school, and he very seriously told me that we couldn't be friends anymore. I asked why, and he just said, because. He went so far as to giving me back the Polaroid of me smiling like a dork, the one I had exchanged for the Polaroid of him, both of them signifying our friendship. Because nothing had really happened, because the world was a different place 20 years ago, and because the photos weren't explicit in nature, nothing happened to Nikki's dad. but that's not for lack of trying on both of our mothers' parts. I remember going to the police station, telling them everything with my mother there beside me, and repeating the story again to various lawyers. But the most we were able to accomplish was preventing Nikki's dad from seeing Nikki and Angela. Apparently, by coming to the house when Nikki's mother wasn't there, he had violated the terms of their custody agreement. When it was all over, the meetings and everything else, Nikki and his family ended up moving. Apparently, Nikki knew this was going to happen, and that's why he told me that we couldn't be friends anymore. I want to say that I managed to give him the photo back before he left, and that we shared a pudding cup one last time. But I can't, because those things never happened. He moved, and I stayed. And for a really, really long time, I sat alone at the tree during recess. Eventually, I made new friends. Eventually, I stopped waiting for him to move back. And eventually, I was a happy kid again. But I have never, not once in my life, forgotten about Nicky or what happened in his basement that day. The way everything about him changed so drastically. If it weren't for his dad, I'd like to think we would have remained friends, at least through childhood. Growing up in the 90s, my mom was always very protective towards my sister and me. Most of the time, it seemed to us like overkill, like we were the sheltered girls of our neighborhood. But there was one incident from my childhood that makes me glad my mom never dropped her guard, not even once. I was a preteen, probably 10 or 11 years old. My mom and I had finished doing some shopping at Sam's Club, and we'd stopped at Wendy's for an early dinner. To my eyes, nothing unusual happened while we were there. We stood in line, ordered, ate, and we left. We were walking in the parking lot and almost had made it back to the minivan when my mom said, sort of loudly, that she should probably go to the bathroom before driving home. I remember thinking that that was a bit weird because we weren't that far away from home. I was just old enough that sometimes if my mom had to run into a store briefly, she would give me the keys and let me sit in the locked van and read. The back windows were tinted, so it was hard to see if someone was inside, and she would always rush through her business and come jogging back to the van to minimize the time she left me alone. So I asked her then if I could have the keys. She said no. She thought that I ought to try to use the bathroom too. I remember telling her that I didn't have to go, when through gritted teeth, she told me, well, try anyway. On our way back into the restaurant, we passed a middle-aged man. He was a bit dirty looking, as if he'd spent all day welding or working on cars. He was of average height and thin, and had longish gray-brown hair. Nothing about him was remarkable to me, and he only made brief eye contact with us as we turned around. He was heading to a pickup truck, parked in the front of the lot, while we were parked more towards the left side of the building. When we get back inside the restaurant, my mom didn't head towards the bathroom, but instead led me to a table and sat down. "Aren't we going to the bathroom?" I asked. "No," my mom said. "We're waiting here until that man leaves." She was talking about that man that walked out behind us, heading to the red pickup truck. Aside from the grime, he didn't seem weird to me, so I thought my mom was making a snap judgment. "Why?" I asked. "I kept catching him staring at us in line," she explained. "He would look at you and look away, then look back again. Then he left right after we did. It just didn't feel right, and I'd rather be safe than sorry." I told her that I didn't see anything, but then quickly asked if I could get a Frosty while we waited. My mom was looking down into her wallet to see if she had cash for my ice cream, when the red pickup truck rolled by the front window of the restaurant, impossibly slow. The man in the driver's seat was turned so much so that his shoulders were almost square with the restaurant as he passed, looking in through that big window. His eyes sought us out inside and found me. I will never forget the full bore of his eyes as he stared at me for the whole length of his passing the window, before accelerating to normal speed and driving away. I'm 33 now and still get the shivers when I think about that day, that man's stare, and the way my mom checked her mirrors for a red pickup truck the entire ride home. This happened back when I was in college. I was home for the summer working. My boyfriend was also home for the summer, working and living with his parents about an hour and a half away. We finally had a rare day when neither of us needed to work, so he drove down to spend the day with me. We were saving for the coming school year, so we tried not to spend too much money, which ended up meaning we ate lunch and dinner with my family at my house. After dinner, wanting to get some alone time as a couple, we decided to pick up root beer floats at Sonic and drive out to a local state park where young couples like to hang out. We parked and walked out to one of the little covered picnic tables in the woods. While the parking lot was well lit because of how thick the woods were, it was quite dark sitting at the picnic table itself. We'd hung out here late into the night before and always felt perfectly safe. But for some reason on this evening, I felt rather nervous sitting in the dark. So when another couple popped out of the woods past where we were and started making out, leaning up against the other end of the table, we moved to my boyfriend's pickup. My boyfriend turned on the radio, and we sat in companionable silence, attempting to eat our ice cream before too much of it melted. Due to the heat of summer, we had the windows rolled all the way down. After a little while, the couple we'd seen come out of the woods left. Looking around, I realized something odd. Although there were normally at least half a dozen other vehicles parked in this particular lot on any evening, we were now the only vehicle in sight. Even so, I didn't think much of it and continued finishing up my float. All of a sudden, I got the worst feeling possible. You know that feeling when your hair stands up on the back of your neck because you can feel someone looking at you when you thought you were alone? It started like that, but got much worse. I had the distinct feeling that I needed to run in the pit of my stomach. I started looking around and realized my boyfriend was also looking around nervously about the same time he noticed that I was doing it. I asked him, did he have a bad feeling? His reply was an emphatic hell yes, uttered as he started the truck and began to drive out of the park. Now, since we were facing into the park, he had to make a wide U-turn. As we passed by the area where we'd been parked, a man stepped out to the edge of the woods. Seeing someone appear from a spot that you weren't expecting can be unsettling on its own. But to kind of put two and two together in real time and realize why you were feeling watched in the first place doesn't make that feeling any more settled. The guy was dressed in dark clothes and a full jacket, which was even more odd given the season. I think that it took us less than 5 seconds to see him and drive past, but his face is more or less burned into my memory bank. Late 40s, light complexion, tall and gangly, gray hair tucked beneath a ball cap, sunken in eyes that made him seem even older, or perhaps just more hollow. Maybe under the light of day, he wouldn't have been so eek-inducing, but under the cover of darkness, he wasn't a very reassuring fellow. This transpired late on a Wednesday night, and about a week later, some teenagers exploring the park at night found 2 deceased bodies in the woods, just past where we'd been seated at that picnic table. Neither body had been there long, but both showed obvious signs of not being natural deaths. When the crime was eventually solved, it came out that a man living in a shack on the property and working as a maintenance worker for the park had killed those 2 people the Saturday night after our experience. We don't know the circumstances under which those 2 individuals lost their lives, although it's very clear that there are much better ways to go than the way they did. The local newspaper ran a story on this case after it had been cracked, which involved an article and the obligatory mugshot of the suspected perp. The photo shown in the paper was a photo of the man we'd seen step out of the woods and watch us leave. This I had no doubt about. The moment I saw those eyes, that looked like they were staring at me from within the newspaper. I didn't follow the case beyond what the paper showed. I don't know if he's locked up for the rest of his life. Those things I'm okay with. What I'm less okay with is that I don't know if I'll ever forget that sunken-eyed stare he shot at us while we were leaving that night. We are years removed now, and there are still times where I feel like those eyes are trained right on me. When I was about 11 or 12, my parents got a Ouija board for the three of us to play with. For context, I'm an only child, and I currently turned 40 this past year. As a family, we never were that religious, which is funny because all three of us were of different religions. My now late mom being Roman Catholic, dad being Orthodox Jewish, and myself being the odd one, raised Reformed Jewish due to my paternal grandmother's wishes. Needless to say, we never had spooky encounters, and just thought of this as a fun thing we could all do as a family. That all changed when my father lost his mother that next year, my Grammy Dodd. We used the board with actual success, which made my father and mother tear up. It was a lot for them, so we packed up the board and stored it away for another year. One day, my best friend and I decided to take it out, as one of our favorite grunge rockers tragically passed away that year. We weren't expecting much, seeing as how we didn't know the rocker personally, but when we both felt it moving, our faces turned white. We both swore to each other that we didn't move it. We were hardly even touching it. It slowly entered the startling sentence, "Courtney did it." To say that we were both beyond shaken would be an understatement. We told my parents, and they, without a doubt, believed us, but warned us to use the board sparingly, as they were still a little shaken up from my Grammy's experience. We took heed to what they were saying, and the board stayed in the closet for the next few years, untouched. Around 2001, maybe 2002, I had a group of 6 friends that I had met 2 years earlier. They had all been friends their whole life, as they were all from the next town over and outside of my school district. We became very close, very fast, when I moved into my grandmother's old apartment that was in their town. It was myself and 2 girls, and occasionally her little sister and their 3 guy friends. One day, we all met at the Thruway restaurant and truck stop to wait for my girlfriend to get out of work. She worked at the stop Cinnabon and would always smell heavenly fresh off of a shift. We were in 2 cars, the girls in mine and the guys in Vinny's car. Once all together, we talked about what we were going to get into now that we were all together and the weekend was officially starting. We all decided that us girls would get the food and the guys would get the beer. Mind you, we were all only about 18 or 19 at the time, but fake IDs were pretty easy to come by for us. Needless to say, we were all amped up for our plan and said we would all meet back at my girl's place, as it was closest to most everyone there. This was about a year or 2 before the most well-off of us had cell phones. So when the boys didn't show, and there was no word from them for almost an hour and a half, we all got pretty worried. Finally, my friend's house phone rang, and my friend's mom picked up. I'm a little fuzzy on who called who, but they called to tell us that there was a bad car accident, and our friend Duck had flown out the windshield almost 60 feet before succumbing to his injuries. Immediately devastated, we barely got out if our other 2 friends were okay. Luckily, they were. Apparently, Duck was driving, and they went around a bend going just a little too fast when they clipped a tree, and he flew out the window. This news rocked our small group and our town, seeing as Duck was such a sweet and fun-loving soul. Things changed after that. The boys, in their depressed funk, turned to drugs and alcohol, and us girls split apart too because it was all just so painful to think about. A few months later, we all got together for the first time in a while. I forgot what we were doing that day because, honestly, what happened next is what seared into my mind. We were all walking into my house when I heard my mother yell out to my dad, "Are you moving that?" Out of curiosity, all 6 of us cautiously shuffled into the entrance of the room that they were in. There we saw my parents trying to talk to my Grammy on the board when it started spelling something out, which is when my mom yelled to my dad, asking if he was moving it. Both looking scared and the 6 of us feeling the tension, we were all locked in to what it was spelling out. One by one, it spelled out, Vinny was driving. My parents had no real clue what this even meant, as I kept the whole thing pretty much quiet from them, so they wouldn't worry about me or my friends. But we all knew. We all looked over at Vinny, and his face turned a shade of white, then green, that I've never seen on a person since. He ran into the bathroom, and we all heard him throwing up. When he came out, we didn't grill him or even question him. We knew what this meant. Just to clarify, my other guy friend that was in the car that night said they already got the beers and were driving back. They were already a little buzzed, so when the car crashed, they made a pact to say Duck was driving, so Vinny wouldn't get a DUI as a minor and destroy his chances at a normal life. We all understood and weren't even that mad. All of us, except for Duck, I suppose, being that that was the one and only thing he managed to say to us, tells us that there may have been some kind of resentment left between the 3 of them over it. I mean, I can only speculate, but being as Duck wasn't driving and ended up taking the rap for it, for his family to have that memory of him to hold on to must not have made him feel too great. So he wanted to clear the air with us, so we all knew what really happened. In the end, poor Vinny ended up paying in the long run. Unfortunately, he turned to even harder drugs and alcohol to cope with what had happened, and ended up contracting a virus from living the way that he did. I saw him once, about 10 years ago, walking out in front of a place where meetings were held. He claimed that he was doing okay, but I could tell that he really wasn't. I could tell carrying that burden had been very hard on him, and I don't know what's happened to him since. The girls and I lost touch too, but reconnected on social media a few years back, and we all started families of our own. Seems like we're all doing fairly well. We haven't pulled that board out since, but I have thought about it every day since my mom passed back in 2015. I know in my heart of hearts that there are spirits on the other side, and if they have unfinished business, they will try with all their might to reach out and set the record straight. About a year back, I was living with a mate of mine. I stayed in a ground floor flat that kind of sits in a cul-de-sac and is a bit of a pain to walk to, kind of detached from the community, if that makes any sense at all. The only times that I felt completely secure were daylight hours, depending on the time of year. The block of flats is kind of an L shape. Our entrance sits kind of inside that 90-degree angle. Inside the main building, there's a flat on either side and stairs in front. The immediate entrance hallway is very dark. I feel like the lights choose when and when not to work. The flats themselves are basic. A hallway, 2 small bedrooms, a bathroom, decent-sized living room, and a small kitchen. The hallway inside the units is quite long, and the living room is at the end of it. Both bedrooms face each other, so we can talk directly from our doorways. Once again, if that makes sense. It was about 11, maybe 11:30 p.m., and my flatmate was already in her room, presumably asleep. She had a habit of leaving things unlocked, and I'm the type of person that I have to make sure everything is locked up before I head off to sleep. I will admit, she'd gotten better and normally had at least the chain on the door if it wasn't all the way locked. She always goes to bed early, so this itself wasn't weird. I was in the living room, and I decided to grab a pint of water before heading to bed myself. I went to the kitchen, which is attached to the living room, switching on the kitchen light, and filling up a glass. The car park in front of the flat was very dark. I remember feeling kind of eerie, and I wasn't sure why, but something felt off. That kind of feeling you get when you switch the light off and run up the stairs before whatever's chasing you gets their hand around your neck. Anyway, I had a couple of sips of water and filled the glass a little bit more before heading out of the kitchen when the front doorbell went. I froze. I didn't even know we had a doorbell. About 10 seconds passed before the mail slot attached to the door was hit twice, causing my stomach to sink. I felt trapped in the kitchen, and it's important to note two things. One, if you step out of the kitchen, it puts you in perfect line with the hallway if the living room door is open, which it was. Two, our front door had a bloody window on it, so you could see silhouettes of anyone outside or in. Us being girls, we had a cute gray curtain across it, but it was pretty see-through itself. I grabbed my phone and called my mate who was in her room, right next to the front door. We both whispered, "Did you hear that?" Both thinking that we might have misheard something. We had to whisper because the walls to our unit were like paper. You could always hear people coming and going, no matter how quiet they attempted to be. She came to her bedroom doorway but couldn't go forward any further because then she'd be in direct sight of the window. I edged my way out of the kitchen, keeping flat against the wall, eventually sinking to the floor, texting my roommate because now we were both closer to the door, and if we spoke, whomever was outside would most likely hear us. Another thing you should probably know is that the person must have buzzed other flats to get into the building, but they didn't buzz ours. So I reckon they saw me from the kitchen window. Lying in kind of an army crawl, I saw the silhouette of a tall, broad, bald man. It could only have been a man. He chapped the letterbox again, but just stood there. Terrified, I mouthed to my maid, "Did you lock the door?" Grimly, she shakes her head no. The chain wasn't on the door either, which meant all that stood between us and whoever was outside was a thin sheet of wood and a lock that wasn't latched. It's now or never, I supposed. I crawled as low as I could to my bedroom, crawled to my desk, grabbed my keys, crawled to the front door, and frantically shoved the keys in the lock and twisted, at the same time putting the chain on the door. This was no doubt a noisy affair, and whoever was on the outside obviously noticed that I was there, hitting the letterbox once again and trying the handle simultaneously as I desperately tried to twist the crap out of that old school key in the lock. I finally got it. Terrified to stand up, my mate put her head out her room to see if we were cool, and we no longer saw the silhouette of that man anymore. In a kind of half-stoned, half-asleep stupor, she reckoned to just go back to bed. But something nagged at me though, really badly. Remember how I said we could hear people coming and going really easily? It was eerily quiet in the building, and not once did either of us hear the building's main door open or shut. That meant that this someone was still in the building. We had one person across from us, and two people above us, and then two above them. Two of those flats are students. Our neighbor across the hall was a 98-year-old woman. There was a couple and a sort of short, long-haired chill guy. Nobody we knew, none of our neighbors, matched the frame of that man in our flat window. I stayed up until I couldn't anymore, texting mates, jamming my room door shut, and keeping my hockey stick next to my bed. I realized about a month after this that the service button to the front of the main building was broken, and anyone could come in if they pressed it. They'd be unheard coming in if they were quiet, and knew that they had to be careful with the door as it was old and heavy. I still think that whoever it was had seen me through the kitchen window and thought to try their luck. This could have easily been a completely different story. Always lock your doors. Double lock them, no matter how safe you reckon your area is. To this day, we have literally no idea who that was or why they came ringing. And for the rest of our time in that flat, we never had anyone else use the doorbell again. I'm going back some years for this, but it's one of those things that has stuck with me well into adulthood. My very first job ever was at McDonald's. The building that it was in was attached to a gas station and located right off of a busy highway. I was 14 at the time, and it seemed like at that age, bad luck just followed me. I had already dropped out of school by that point, so I started my day with a 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. shift. This early, the store was usually empty, so only 3 people, myself included, were in the restaurant. The manager, who was in the back, the cook, who was also in the back, and I, the cashier, who obviously was up front. I was wiping down the counter when a man who looked to be in his mid-30s or early 40s came in. He didn't approach the counter to order anything, but just went straight to the restrooms, which were in the restaurant area, around the corner from my workstation. Many truckers and travelers would come in to simply use the washrooms and leave, so this wasn't an uncommon occurrence. I didn't think much of it when he passed. But after a few minutes, conceivably after the man had finished, he came up to the counter and said, "Excuse me, I was just in the bathroom, and one of the toilets is overflowing." I immediately came around the counter and let him lead me towards the restroom, when suddenly, I got a horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach and stopped dead in my tracks. I became very aware that no one was in the restaurant area, and the only other 2 people in the store were in the back and wouldn't be able to hear me if I went into the restroom. The man now had the restroom door open and realized that I had paused just a little bit down the hallway. He nonchalantly said, "Come on in, I'll show you," which came off innocently enough, but it still didn't sit well with me. I smiled and said, "Just wait one moment, I'll go get my manager," and I started making my way back towards the counter. "But it'll only take a minute," he called out. I met my manager in the back and explained to him that a man was complaining about an overflowing toilet. My manager went to check it out, and I followed closely behind him. When we turned the corner, that man was now gone, and when we entered the restroom, there was no toilet overflowing. Me and my manager exchanged a look, but we never brought it up again. To this day, I feel like some divine intervention gave me the wisdom to know not to follow that man into the bathroom. The whole situation only lasted a few seconds, but it felt like forever. I was young and trusting, and this man could have done God knows what, and I wouldn't have been heard from behind that bathroom door. Afterwards, he could have easily left, gotten away with whatever it was he had planned, and could have been on the highway before anyone was aware. As if it needs saying, I never did see that man again. I've been through some pretty scary experiences in my life, but this was the worst thing that I feel I've ever gone through. I used to be a very naive, innocent kind of person. I was the type of optimist who believed that there was a touch of goodness in every heart, which is a dangerous mindset to be in. I realize now that seeing the world through my rose-colored glasses put a big, flashing red target right on my back. Often, when you think of scary stories involving creepy behavior and psychological abuse, you think of an occurrence from a stranger. In my case, it came from my mother-in-law. My husband's mother initially adored me, not for any reason other than thinking that I could be easily controlled. I was meek with a passive personality, so it made sense that I would come across like someone who could be easily influenced. Looking back on it, I cringe at how creepy the situation really was. For the sake of the story, I'll call my mother-in-law by the name of Mrs. Psycho. At the beginning of my relationship with my husband, Mrs. Psycho and I were getting along great, or so I thought. She'd take me shopping, give me compliments about my hair, and girly stuff like that. As the relationship with my partner grew more serious, she'd rant and rave to everyone in our neighborhood about how much she adored me and how I was like the daughter she never had. So naturally, I thought things were progressing positively. But certain things were just really off about Mrs. Psycho. I noticed little tidbits of her behavior at parties and neighborhood social gatherings. She'd sulk in a corner, and I'd chalk it up as her being socially awkward or anxious. But looking back at it now, I noticed that she was always whimpering about something negative going on in her life. How she fell off her bike and hurt her elbow while riding through a construction zone. How one neighbor complained about her parking in front of his house. Losing her job because she didn't get along with a coworker. The list just went on and on. In every story, she portrayed herself as a victim of some unusual circumstances. One huge red flag that my mind didn't understand at the time was a story that she was always telling about her other son, my husband's brother. She'd say some really disturbing things about how he'd held her, my husband, and his dad hostage in their own home, and how he'd physically punched their father in the face. The way she described the story made it sound like my husband's brother was a bully to the whole family, and my husband didn't seem to think that it was quite as severe as she made it sound. Regardless, in all her wild stories and accusations about him, she always scolded her son in ways that I just can't imagine ever scolding my own child. What my husband and I didn't fully interpret at the time was the underlying problem, which wasn't necessarily his brother, but the woman who had been a driving force for the insanity behind the behavior. Psychological abuse can trigger emotional responses in very unpredictable and disturbing ways. Mrs. Psycho's behavior became evidently creepy after our engagement. She showed signs of unhealthy enmeshment. First, she was angry that we didn't tell her immediately when we'd gotten engaged. Then she was angry when we changed the wedding date, without first asking for her permission. She expressed a desire for my future husband and I to live in the upstairs of her house and pay rent. We told her that we could afford our own home, and we want to start a family, so that wouldn't work out. The infuriation in her eyes was frightening. She would look normal one moment. Then, if you told her something she didn't want to hear, her eyes would turn black. The memory of her eyes still sends a frightening chill down my spine. From there, she became increasingly controlling. Mrs. Psycho and her husband, Mr. Psycho, would start showing up to our house every other day or so. I started counting how long they could go without having to see us, and that number came to a mere 3 days. There was no privacy, and I felt I had to close the curtains over our windows every night. I just had that uneasy feeling, you know? I locked the bedroom door as routine before bed, just to be on the extra safe side. Despite our relationship being pleasant in the beginning, I noticed that I was now feeling like I was treading on eggshells around Mrs. Psycho. Or rather, landmines. It seemed like anything I said was offensive to her, no matter how innocent. I realized I couldn't talk to her like I used to be able to when me and her son were just dating. I remembered when we'd be able to have a nice, in-depth conversation, and I had even allowed myself to be vulnerable with her. I confided in her about how I had a lot of social anxiety, and that her son came into my life during a time that I was suffering from crippling depression. I talked about how he'd brought a ray of sunshine into my life, thinking that speaking kindly about her son would please her. But she just had this unfeeling, glazed look across her face. Hoping to mend my relationship with her, I decided to help her out one day with organizing her antiques. She had this hobby of going to auctions and buying and selling knickknacks, buttons, and other stuff like that. She would get very proud of her collections of things that I sort of thought were junk, but to be polite, I told her I saw beauty in these things, hoping to get back on her good side. There were some creepy dolls in the mix, including this horrifying looking vampire doll with piercing red eyes. She said she'd had that doll for years and used to scare her sons with it when they were little kids. She laughed at the memory, and the sound had an eerie, satanical vibe to it. As if this wasn't enough to freak me out, she then told me this story about how a female coworker complained about her to the HR department at her company. To seek revenge on this woman, Mrs. Psycho wrote a letter that was meant for the coworker's husband, telling him that she was cheating on him. To remain as anonymous as possible, she told me how she slipped on a pair of black gloves and drove the letter to a faraway location so that her address couldn't be traced. I remember feeling very uneasy about her story, wondering how she could get angry enough to drive hours away just to cause emotional harm to another human being. There came a point after hearing this story when I didn't want to be left alone with my husband's mom anymore. My husband tried to talk to his parents about how I was feeling, the eggshells that I was standing upon anytime I was around them. But they flipped the narrative to say that they were the ones feeling on eggshells around me. During this time, I painstakingly realized that psychological torture exists in the form of extreme invalidation. Not having your feelings acknowledged can really drive a person crazy. It was then when I felt a little more clued into what may have happened to Mrs. Psycho's other son. I can't be sure because I never met the guy, but I think he was driven mad by his mother's severe emotional neglect. Now, she was pulling the same tricks on me and my husband, gaslighting us into believing that we were just too sensitive. When my husband and I started figuring out that something was off, things just got even creepier. His parents began showing up to our house to corner us into submission. What I mean is, they tell us stories to make them seem like victims so that we would give in to demands of what they wanted at the time. If we denied their requests, they'd use psychological manipulation by telling us that we were uncaring or ungrateful. One demonstration of this manipulation was when I became pregnant. I explained that the smell of pizza made me extremely sick, but this was ignored. When Mrs. Psycho insisted that we go to a pizza restaurant for her birthday, I was confused with why I felt like I couldn't say no. My husband was in the same predicament. Somehow, I think we sensed that something bad would happen to us if we declined. This is also because Mrs. Psycho's husband and her sister had contacted us, telling us explicitly that we weren't allowed to say no to her dinner invitations anymore. They explained it like saying no hurts her feelings, but there was something else there that I can't quite explain. Something hidden beneath the surface that sounded really threatening. I had no idea why, but I didn't feel safe. Then, only 2 weeks after giving birth to our daughter, I had the creepiest interaction of my life. Mrs. Psycho caught me alone while I was on my front porch. The weather was really nice, so I was rocking with my baby in one of our outdoor chairs. She came up to the doorstep and assumed a seat in a chair next to me. Then, in a quiet, ominous voice, she said to me, "You have to share her, you know." Her black eyes flicked to the infant in my arms. I know what you might be thinking, but this wasn't said in a cute, excited new grandma kind of way. Her voice sounded cold and possessive, with certain passive-aggressive intent behind the statement. I naturally clutched my arms around my daughter tighter, feeling a protective instinct take over me. Mrs. Psycho had expressed to me before that she'd always wanted to have a daughter, but was only ever able to have sons. Maybe I was being influenced by the postpartum hormones, or just overall feeling paranoid. But a disturbing thought occurred to me that she might want to get rid of me somehow, to have my daughter to herself. I later told my husband about the bizarre interaction with his mom, and how I couldn't keep up with the heavy psychological demands of his parents any longer. It was all taking a strange, emotional toll on me, as well as a strain on our marriage. And I still couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Nevertheless, they were causing us a lot of stress, which was impacted on me all the more while I was trying to adapt to my new role as a mother. They even restricted me in bizarre ways, telling me I was not allowed to refer to our daughter as my baby. I previously posted on Facebook about how excited and happy I was to be a new mom. I posted a side-by-side picture of me with my daughter with the caption, "She has my eyes," which was meant to be lighthearted and innocent. My mother-in-law commented on the post with, "My son had something to do with it too," which not only put a damper on the mood, but also felt creepy. Like, why did she have to mention something we already know? It was almost as if my happiness made her more enraged. I really felt like I was starting to go crazy. The stress was enough to make me physically sick. At first, my husband hesitated when I told him about my concerns, stating the usual spiel that was natural for him to say, that they were his parents, and he couldn't just drop contact with them. But something in his voice contained fear, and it wouldn't take long before he would realize just how f***ed up the situation actually was. The incident that drove him to the point of cutting off his parents happened when they cornered us in our own living room, demanding that we watch their unruly dog while they went on vacation for 5 days. My husband almost caved, but stayed firm when he told him, "No, we can't. We have a 2-month-old baby to look after." The murderous glare that his mom then flashed at me was intense and enough to make me want to crawl out of my skin. You know that look someone gives before they are about to attack? It looks something like that from the movies. Very primal and filled with hate. I thought for sure she was about to lunge at me and wring her hands around my neck, causing me death by strangulation. I was terrified. Mr. and Mrs. Psycho eventually left our house, but they were clearly angry that they weren't able to convince us to conform to their will. My husband and I had a dark, suspicious feeling that something bad was about to happen. First, we received lengthy emails from Mrs. Psycho, mostly insulting me. She said she thought that I was brainwashing her son, and she went on to portray herself, once again, as a victim. She used the knowledge of my anxiety disorder to make an argument that I was mentally unstable and dangerous. She threatened to post about me on Facebook and make her life a living hell if we didn't apologize for deviating from what she wanted. At the same time, she told me that I was dead to her and listed all the mistakes I've ever made in the past, as well as criticizing my faults. I'd be lying if I said this didn't sting. My husband and I needed space to recover from the emotional wounds that she had inflicted on us. We remained silent, not wanting to engage with her any further. My husband and I were pretty scared as well as being hurt, spending most of our days cooped up in our bedroom, not knowing what to expect. But we stayed strong through the process of separating from the toxic relationship. Mrs. Psycho proceeded to make good on her threat, posting about me publicly on Facebook. She said I was batshit crazy. She even went a step further, saying that I had borderline personality disorder, in all capital letters. This came out of nowhere. She knew I had anxiety, but I'd never mentioned anything to her about being borderline, because I wasn't diagnosed with it at all. It didn't end there though. She also posted a dramatic story of how we had banned her from seeing her grandchild. An active smear campaign against me ensued, as Mr. and Mrs. Psycho actually went door to door to everyone's house in my community, posing as good citizens to warn everyone about their extremely dangerous, manipulative, 5-foot-tall daughter-in-law. My neighbors didn't react the way that was expected though. They were more wary of her than of me. Instead of ruining my reputation, which was the desired effect, most people in my neighborhood were majorly creeped out by Mrs. Psycho's efforts. They were equally creeped out by Mr. Psycho's willingness to go along with the whole thing. I guess after years of being beaten down with his wife's abuses, he was just an empty shell of a man, a flying monkey to the proverbial wicked witch. There are a few doctors and therapists in my neighborhood who couldn't officially diagnose her since she wasn't their patient, but they said off the record that they believed Mrs. Psycho may have been projecting, meaning that she was, in essence, confessing that she is potentially dangerous and volatile while pinning it all on me. This, along with some stories of Mrs. Psycho's interactions with other people in our neighborhood, confirmed that something was disturbingly off with this lady. This information made the situation all the more unsettling when Mr. and Mrs. Psycho showed up to our house for what we suspected would be a confrontation. My husband and I were watching Survivor in the living room with our baby when the doorbell rang. He crept to the front window to peer behind the curtains to see who it was, and I could immediately see the fear on his face. "It's my parents," he said, and my blood ran cold. I instinctively ran with the baby upstairs, pausing only to tell him that it was his choice whether to answer the door or not, since they're his parents, but that me and the baby would be hidden away. As I made my way up the stairs, my husband hovered by the front door, conflicted. He didn't know what to do. Meanwhile, I could hear jostling at the front door, like his parents were trying to force their way inside our house with a spare key. I thank God to this day that we had just changed the locks a few days before, so they couldn't get in. I proceeded to run upstairs and close the bedroom door behind me, locking both me and the baby inside. I held my daughter close, my heart thudding wildly against my chest. When there was a knock on the bedroom door, I reacted with a jolt. It scared me shitless, but it was my husband's voice on the other side that calmed me down. He told me he didn't answer the door. He was trembling when I unlocked the door to let him in. His face was as pale as a ghost. He showed me a text message from his dad saying, "Anyone home?" Followed by another text from his mother later, saying, "You're a coward, hiding behind your keyboard." I don't know what would have happened if my husband had chosen to answer the door, but I do shudder to think about it. My husband and I both blocked them after that. Phone numbers, social media accounts, everything. They moved away to another state, thank God. We have since been no contact with his parents for almost 2 years now, and our daughter is growing in a loving environment, free of toxicity. Sadly, we have had to block some of my husband's other family members because they kept telling us that we should talk to my in-laws, which, by the way, feels a lot like being told, "Please contact your abuser." For this reason, I sometimes feel like it would have almost been better to be physically abused than mentally abused, because then there would be some form of visible evidence of the harm that they had inflicted. In the meantime, they have so far made no attempts to contact us with an apology or anything. Instead, they once reached out with a nasty, "Have a shitty anniversary. You two are a match made in hell," which only further secured our decision to cut contact with them. I have since armed myself with knowledge so that I'll be less naive about creepy behavior in the future. I've studied up on narcissism and the negative psychological impact that some people can have on others through gaslighting and extreme invalidation. I hope everyone listening out there may be aware that not all abuse is physical. This story is about my stepmother, a woman that I have known since before I could remember. She was really good friends with my mom and dad throughout high school, so I already knew her before all of this happened in my life. Unfortunately, my mother was an alcoholic and a pill addict, which led to pretty bad neglect for several years when I was young, which is a story for another day. After missing most of my 3rd grade year, the Department of Child Services got involved, and my dad got custody of me. He was dating stepmother at the time, and at first, everything was fairly normal. She was like an older sister, a friend even. It wasn't too long before I noticed things started to change though. One day, when I was about 9 years old, I was sitting on the living room floor, playing with my back against the couch. Stepmother crossed the living room to go down the hallway, and as she did, she seemed to shoulder check the doorway. As soon as she did this, she turned around and began yelling at me, accusing me of pushing her. I stared at her dumbfounded because I hadn't moved from my spot on the floor. She continued yelling and accusing me as I tried to rationalize it in my head. Maybe I got up and didn't remember, but why would I push her? I really had no negative feelings towards her at this point, so it just didn't make any sense. But she was an adult, and I was a child. Surely she knew what she was talking about. Stepmother was a taller, skinny woman with long golden blonde hair, straightened through the length, with those poofy 80 bangs up top. She typically wore high-waisted jeans and kept long, pristine red nails that would end up being a horrifying symbol to me into my teen years. Things only got worse as I got older. I would speak to my mom on occasion over the phone or by letter the first few years, but each time I did, stepmother would become more and more hostile towards me, claiming that the contact that I had with my mother was making me, quote, misbehave. But I was always an introverted kid. I loved reading and school, and I was a bit of a nerd and hated getting into trouble. So this accusation didn't make sense to me even then. But what could I do about it? Before too long, I noticed that stepmother looked for any opportunity alone with me to treat me however she wanted. Stepmother quickly became extremely militant. Each morning, she woke me up for school by bursting into my room and aggressively jerking the covers from my body. Some mornings, even grabbing my feet, digging her nails in, and twisting on my toes. I was expected to follow a strict schedule on school mornings. 6:15 a.m., out of bed. 6:15 to 6:25, get dressed for school. 6:25 a.m., breakfast. And at this time, I was expected to stand in the exact center point of the threshold between the kitchen and the dining room, ready to take my breakfast and sit in my spot at the table. 6:35 a.m., done with breakfast. 6:35 to 6:45, finish getting ready for school. 6:45 a.m., be sitting cross-legged in the center of the living room, waiting on everyone else to be ready. If I didn't follow the schedule down to the minute, punishment would be doled out. She would grab my hands upon taking my breakfast, twisting one or two fingers out of the socket, pulling me close to grit through her teeth at me with glaring, hateful eyes. Sometimes she would step on my feet, grinding her heels into my bare skin, twisting and glaring hate unto me. On a few occasions, she even broke my wooden hairbrushes across my face, leaving bursted blood vessels and massive bruises. When the damage was too obvious to ignore, she would try to hide me for a day or so, gently waking me the next morning, acting as though I was sick and telling me that I was too ill to go to school, brushing my hair back and telling me to go back to sleep. This treatment rolled over into my days after school and would evolve into other aggressive behaviors. She made sure to conceal any sign of mistreatment from my father, but still, some happened right under his nose. At the dinner table, she would dig her toes into my leg and scrape so hard that she would shave off chunks of skin from my shins with her toenails. Even at church, placing what looked like an affectionate hand on my back, but would proceed to give me an extremely painful and deep pinch to my back, leaving huge bruises in their place that no one else would see. I was given an hour and a half after school each day to do my homework. After that time, I was expected to go to our playroom, where I was to entertain her daughter. Stepmother's daughter was between 5 and 7 when things really started to get bad. I was expected to play what she wanted, when she wanted, and abide by any request made. This was never explicitly said, but understood, and later learned the hard way. One day during the summer, while eating lunch with her daughter in the playroom, the daughter asked me to open her dessert. She had a kid's cuisine that she had merely taken all of 2 bites of. Stepmother would typically leave the plastic on her dessert as a system to encourage her to eat her meal first. Of course, when she asked me to open it, I asked her if she was done eating, passively addressing the fact that she had barely touched her food. I was about 14 at the time, and it seemed like a plausible thing to big sister her about. But when I didn't give her what she wanted, she got up in a huff to go tattle to her mother, as most 6-year-olds do. Stepmother was immediately enraged and barreled down the hallway right in my direction. I don't even think I was out of view of her daughter when she grabbed me by the hair and began dragging me down the hallway. I tried to keep up, but lost my balance and fell to the floor as she continued to drag me to my room, using only my hair. Once we reached the bedroom, she started kicking me in the stomach and then pulled me to my feet to face my bed. She then began rummaging through my belt drawer and pulled out my woven leather belt that she had already used more than once, and then proceeded to beat me with it, starting at my shoulder blades all the way down to my ankles. Heaven forbid if I screamed, because she would only beat me more. The abuse also didn't stop with physical, as she seemed to get a kick out of bullying me. This she wasn't so worried about hiding from my father either, as she would make it seem lighthearted and jovial when he was around. One evening, while having a family dinner at one of our local go-to sit-downs, she started kicking me underneath the table, passing me horribly evil glares. When, after a few minutes of this, she spoke up. "You chew like a cow. Why can't you chew right? Doesn't she chew like a cow?" My dad chuckled, thinking that it was meant lightheartedly, but as he looked down at his meal again, her death glare staring a hole through me with a tight jaw and grit teeth told me otherwise. This became a new target for her abuse. She did this again later when she noticed that I walked on the inside of my house shoes. One day, kicking me in the back of the knees, making me fall to the floor. She began kicking me in the back, knocking the wind out of me, all simply over the way that I walked. This became my daily life. Speaking out seemed ridiculous because all of these punishments just felt so absurd. I didn't tell anyone for a long time, but as I got older, people around me grew wiser. When I was in middle school, my dad and stepmother were called in for questioning by the school. Two of my teachers were highly suspicious of my bruises and constantly swollen fingers. Stepmother proceeded to put on an act, crying and acting hurt and shocked that they would think that she could hurt a child. I changed schools after that year. Things only got worse once I went to high school, as she seemed intimidated by my aging and gaining maturity. Male friends were strictly off limits, and my curves were to be hidden in horribly unflattering clothes. I didn't really mind so much, as I really had very little interest in boys or displaying my womanhood to any degree. However, one afternoon while taking a shower, she burst in the bathroom to remind me of my timing. As she whipped the bathtub curtain open, she saw the hair growing below my waist. Before I could react, she grabbed the hair and jerked it down, pulling out a handful of my pubic hair. She cursed me for not telling her that I had started maturing in that way. I couldn't tell anyone about that instance for years. After the belt beating, however, stepmother's sister-in-law saw my backside and called my dad at work, cursing him out and threatening to report it. That's when I started going to her house on the weekends. After this, I got braver and became less scared. Once I saw people reacting to what little they saw of my stepmother's behavior, I knew I was in the right for sticking up for myself. So I did, in subtle ways at first. I brought jewelry and makeup to school and started to give myself space to express myself. Then one morning, while running a minute or two behind on breakfast, stepmother came to the kitchen in a rage. Why wasn't I finished getting ready for school? Why weren't the dishes clean? Before I could turn around from rinsing my dishes, she was rummaging in the utensil drawer and pulled out a fork. She backed me against the kitchen counter, pressing the fork against my throat. I don't remember what she said to me in those moments, but I remember her hot breath in my ear, hissing through her teeth at me, and I remember the chill of the cold metal prongs on my throat. I was no more than 16 at this time. My last day there was field day of my junior year. I decided to wear a cute outfit that stepmother's sister-in-law had bought for me for casual days. It was a cute cap sleeve striped t-shirt, cut femininely to suit my curves, with long matching shorts. I knew she wouldn't like it, but I also knew that it was completely appropriate for a girl my age, even very conservative in comparison to my other peers. She saw me as I was walking down the hallway towards my bedroom, and I saw the rage fill her. She came at me, nails first, grabbing my arms as she dug them in. This was when I snapped, and I fought her off, shoving her straight into the wall. It was my turn to have rage fill me as I went to the living room to grab the phone. "If you ever touch me again, I'm going to call the cops." She went pale, and suddenly, I wasn't scared for myself anymore. I couldn't control it, and I laughed. "You're scared," I said, suddenly enlightened. Her face went blank as she straightened up and walked towards me. "If I have to make your dad choose between you and me, it's not going to be you," she said coldly. I ignored the sentiment because I knew she was delusional to think something like that. I went to my bedroom and packed a bag. She didn't try to stop me, but she did make sure to let me know that if I left, that I wasn't welcome back. I ended up spending that summer in Florida with stepmother's sister-in-law and moved in with my grandmother for the next several years. I only saw stepmother again once in my 20s. She had left my dad by the time I was out of high school for the man she had been cheating on him with. She and I spoke briefly over Facebook in that next year, and I confronted her about what she put me and my father through. Her single callous response: "I'm sorry if you ever felt unloved. I was just really stressed, and you were a pretty rebellious kid." I know that this story doesn't exactly finish by being wrapped up in a neat little box with a bow. There's a lot of unresolved questions that I have that will likely remain that way for the rest of my life. While I'd like to think that I'm well adjusted and don't carry an inordinate amount of luggage from the years of torment at this woman's hand, I'm not so naive to think that that is entirely true. I was glad to leave that house and that relationship when I did, because my imaginings of just how much worse it could have gotten are at least just that, imaginings.